name of the panel is Current Trends in Street-Level Bureaucracy Research and its Implications for Policy Entrepreneurship. We will take about 20 to 25 minutes for each paper. We will hear the presenter and then the discussant, and you can collect and write down your questions, and hopefully we'll have 5 to 10 minutes at the end of the panel for open it to the rest of the participants. So please welcome Irina Chiorni.
Yes, Jeremy.
That will be our first paper.
Okay.
Good night.
Should I ask that?
Yeah, you can dance if you
No.
want.
Okay.
So you have 15 minutes. I'll give you similar 5 minutes before.
Okay. We would like to thank Nissim and Naomi for giving us the opportunity to present this paper in front of this extraordinary audience. It is a paper, as I told you, that is within the broader, inscribed within the broader research project on religious actors and morality policy implementation, which is led by the University of Bern and the University of Munich, and it's co-authored together with Michalina and Mirai here present. The broader context of this paper is the loss of religious influence on most policy areas within Western Europe and beyond, and especially within the area of morality policies. Now, what morality policies entail is not very clear because there's a lot of debate in the literature, but we draw upon Kneel and his collaborators' definition of morality policy, which refers to the regulation of first principles over life, death, and sexuality. And although the list of morality policies has a variable geometry, the policies that I enumerate here are feature among the primary morality policies that scholars study. And they deal with prostitution, same-sex marriage, euthanasia, or broader assisted dying, abortion, stem cell research, and assisted reproductive technologies. In this paper, we focus on abortion and assisted dying. What we know from this is that indeed religious actors lost the influence during the policy formulation and policy design on morality issues. But our question is if they really capitulate from seeking to influence these issues, or they try to enter, as Muni calls it, through the back door of the policy process and try to influence the process of implementation of these policies. And we argue that religious actors become stakeholders during implementation because these policies go against their interests and their capacity to influence both policy clients and policy addressees, and that therefore they do not give up, despite the fact that they do not have that religious morality does not influence anymore these policies. And in order to explain their behavior during implementation, we draw upon 2 streams of theory. The first one is the concept of accountability regime and the broader street-level bureaucracy research, and the second one is secularization theory. That's because we argue that the behavior of religious actors during the implementation of this policy emulates the behavior of street-level bureaucrats during implementation, and therefore we draw upon a series of concepts that has been developed within this framework. At the same time, let's say that the substantive content of these concepts that help us understand what types of strategies and actions they undertake are also draw, of course, upon secularization theories that give us, let's say, a detailed account of the complexities of religion within liberal states today. And regarding the concept of accountability regime, the central concept that we use from street-level bureaucracy research, although superficially we might think that religious dogma is the ultimate accountability regime of religious actors, we actually argue that just as street-level bureaucrats, they are embedded in a multidimensional accountability regime, for which the religious dogma is one of the the possible regimes which they are accountable to. And that is because secularization theories tell us that the situation of religions in the liberal states is much more complex than that. And that primarily, and of course they also are accountable to state law and institutions, and therefore they have to be accountable to the secular laws that the state enacts within these fields. At the same time, and this is for example what Chavez calls the internal secularization of religions, right? Because religions themselves cannot escape this secularization process, and therefore they are compelled to embrace a series of like elements within their doctrine or within their personnel in order to survive and adapt to the process. And just for an example, the, so to say, weak and secularization of the papal discourse on homosexuality is an example of this very narrow opening towards homosexuality within the Catholic doctrine. And so that's one tendency that, that we observe. Another tendency that we observe is this process of transformation of religion into spirituality, right? In which basically the accountability here is in front of the individual, is vis-a-vis the individual, it's not vis-a-vis the doctrine necessarily, nor the secular law. But what religion as spirituality seeks to do here is basically to cherish and cultivate the divinity within the individual. And that's why we argue that there are these three main accountability regimes that religious actors are embedded into when they act during the implementation of morality policies. The first one is religion, of course, religious dogma, and this would be the assertive religions that seek to impose, of course, the religion doctrine despite the secularization of the law in these fields. And this is what we would call the crusaders. They would act, religious actors would be sort of crusaders during implementation because they would still seek to impose the religious dogma on that. Then what we have is what we call the picky stakeholders. And these are the ones that cherry pick, so to say, which elements of the secular law they embrace within their strategies, within their action repertoires, and which they actually do not, and keep within their, let's say, boundaries of the dogma in these moral issues. And then what we have are the resilient, as we call them. And these are those who rather see religiosity as spirituality and do not seek to fight let's say, the state regulation in these issues, but also not to assert the religious dogma. But rather what they are trying to do is to enter in dialogue with the policy clients, in this case those who seek an abortion or assisted dying, and induce reflection about this phenomenon. So rather this is the direct dialogue with individuals and in which the religious actors actually don't really know what is going to happen, but what they do is to invite to this kind of type of reflection. And we argue that these action strategies describe both the strategies of organized religion, so at the level of religious organizations, but also the action strategies of religious actors on the ground, those that actually enter in contact with this policy, with policy clients. And these action strategies can be pursued both via an organizational logic as well as an individual logic. Why am I saying that? That is because we should take into account that in this particular field of life and death issues, the main policy implementers are doctors. And however, doctors are also embedded in their institutions, right? And for example, Catholic healthcare institutions are a quarter of all healthcare institutions in the world. So we expect that there where we have a healthcare institution with a religious identity, they would definitely try to influence policy implementers and offer guidelines that can range from just mere recommendations to rather impositions about how the medical personnel should act upon these issues. And therefore what they would try to do is to influence policy implementers. At the same time, of course, beyond these healthcare institutions with religious identity, what we do have is the direct contact that exists between religious actors and policy clients, And this can take place through hospital chaplains, through counseling, through pastoral care, etc., etc., etc. So therefore, these action strategies are also played out through the organizational logic and the individual logic. However, of course, these action strategies are ideal types, and we do not expect that one denomination actually follows one action strategy a priori, but that, of course, they are employed by all denominations, and both at the organizational and individual level, and that pretty much what we will see is that the exact type of strategy that religious actors choose is contextually determined, and determined by the set of opportunities, resources, and belief system available to them. And in terms of opportunities, we look at the state-church regime, to which we actually don't really look in this version of the paper, and policy ambiguity, and how that opens windows of opportunity for religious stakeholders to intervene during implementation. Then we look at resources, and of course, having healthcare facilities is a major resource for pursuing, for example, the institutional logic of influence. And then we look at the belief system and the degree to which it actually it is different from the regulation within the law. And we expect that the further the distance between the belief system on these moral issues and the state regulation, the more contentious the strategy is going to be. Of course, all these categories, all these factors are embedded within the context of the secular state, which influence how they play out on the ground. In terms of methodology, we use a comparative research design, and we study abortion and assisted dying policies in Belgium and Switzerland for Catholics, Protestants, and Muslim religious communities. And both Switzerland and Belgium liberalized abortion law more than 2 decades ago and allow abortion upon request in the first 2 weeks of pregnancy. While Belgium has one of the most liberal laws on active euthanasia, together with the Netherlands. And in Switzerland, what we have is that assisted suicide is permitted, and it's not punishable by law. In all these policy areas, the implementers are doctors, with the exception of assisted dying in Switzerland, which actually is taken by 2 private organizations which offer the killing potion to those who want to commit suicide, and they assist them to death, to basically commit suicide. What did we find? We find that, of course, these strategies describe the action repertoire of all religious communities, and both the organizational and the individual level. But that there are, of course, tendencies. And the tendency is to find Catholics to be rather dominant among the Crusaders, and the Protestants to be dominant among the resilient, with Muslims in between. And how does our explanatory framework give an account of that? We see that indeed the policy ambiguity in these two fields offer the windows of opportunity for religious organizations to intervene during implementation. That is because the use of ambiguous concepts such as that the woman is allowed to have an abortion when there is a situation of distress, or that a person is entitled to request euthanasia when there is unbearable psychological and physical pain. The use of these ambiguous concepts, distress or unbearable pain, allows them to redefine what is actually what are the boundaries of distress they are actually going to accept within their premises. So in which situation they are going to accept that an abortion is conducted there, or when psychological or physical pain is actually unbearable. So this allows them to actually define the exact cases, so to cherry pick which cases of abortion or euthanasia are performed within, for example, Catholic hospitals, but also allows, as we call, frontline religious actors to enter in dialogue and try to change the perception of policy clients about what distress means and what unbearable pain means. So this is like the windows of opportunity that policy opens, and leaves a margin of discretion both to policy implementers and to religious stakeholders. Then, of course, resources are fundamental for explaining which type of strategy, if they pursue, which type of logic they are pursuing. Of course, if they have healthcare facilities like the Catholic Church, they would definitely pursue the institutional logic. And if they don't have that, they would definitely try to pursue only the individual logic and try to address just the policy clients. And of course, the resources also explain why Muslims have a much lower level of engagement within the implementation process, just because they don't have so many resources, at least in Western Europe, in comparison to Catholics and Protestants. And then, of course, the belief system is a very, as I say, a core explanatory variable, because it explains why, for example, the Protestant theology is more likely to render resilient strategies. And the belief system, together with the pressure of secularization from the liberal state, also explains why Muslims are rather in between these strategies, right? And pursue rather picky or resilient strategies, just because they are somehow, there's this intent to liberalize Islam within Western Europe, and therefore they are somehow compelled to adopt one of these two strategies. So they are not really allowed to be crusaders, so to say, much more so than there is the pressure on Catholics and Protestants to express, let's say, the assertiveness of their dogma during implementation. And yes, just one more slide I have, so if I may, I was thinking, how can we actually use the data that we have to also contribute to this research agenda on policy entrepreneurship. And we didn't really analyze it in this slide, but what we think is that most likely cases of policy entrepreneurship we're going to find in the field of prostitution and social policy, implemented by religious organizations such as Caritas and Diakoni and so on. So there are, of course, religious organizations that are partners of the state in delivering social policy, especially for the refugees and the homeless and so on. We did not have a look at that, but I think we can go back to the field and get data on social policy and not just morality policy. And I think we have signs that there are cases of policy entrepreneurship in this field, but quite likely that we're not going to find any policy entrepreneurship in life and death policies, at least that we analyze. And I think it's interesting to compare why it is very unlikely to find entrepreneurs here and rather here. So that could be a possible research question. And then, for example, another interesting, let's say, contribution that our data could bring, and hopefully our theoretical framework that we will develop, is how do categorical identities, in this case religion, play out for policy entrepreneurship? Because what we are going to look here is basically street-level bureaucrats, but that have a very strong or stronger religious identity than the other street-level bureaucrats. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now here our discussant, Michael Mintram. Please take something like 6 to 8 minutes maximum.
Okay. Yes, thank you, Aruna. I really did like this paper a lot because there's such a lot of richness in it, and I think your presentation captured that well. So I just want to respond in a few ways. I mean, I think it's sort of getting at the long march in society with change in authority from the church to the state. And while state regulation of behaviour is now dominant, there's residual authority issues. And I think that your comments about the Catholic Church are interesting because it has had and continues to have such a dominant position, and it has a lot of assets on the ground, which allow it to engage in discretion around choice of behaviour more than, say, the Muslim communities, or perhaps even in the Protestant community. So I wonder whether that's something you may want to talk a little bit more about in the paper as that path dependency. But I think that what that does is it sort of puts an interesting gloss on the nub of the problem, I think, which is to whom is the individual accountable. So you can think about an individual doctor. Is the individual doctor accountable to the medical profession and the state rules around what is appropriate behaviour there? Is the individual accountable as a believer, I guess you could say, and how does that change their behaviour? And that, I think, points to really important questions about motivation in the public sphere and dilemmas of motivation. And I think I'm being a little bit simplistic there because I'm reducing it right down to the individual and saying what would the quote unquote good person do in this situation. But actually, you're pointing out there's much more complexity to it because that individual is always embedded in institutions and ideologies that kind of mean that it's not just about in a sense, it's not an individual choice, it's very much a mediated individual choice. But I want to pursue this a little bit more. It's kind of the thing about, there's an interesting thing about the discretion to follow somewhat narrow procedures with respect to considering performing an abortion or assisting with suicide. And that's really the focus here. But there's also, it seems to me, something that sits around this paper is around the discretion that individuals have in the perceptions they have of a situation. And I don't even know whether it's necessarily, it might not necessarily be operating at a conscious level, but that if I can just kind of put it this way, in a particular instance where, say, a young woman is seeking an abortion, the medical, the doctor who's there could be saying, well, I just follow the rules on this, so if the person is within the time that is allowed, then I could perform it, otherwise not. There's also, what I mean about the discretion and perception is for the medical person or perhaps the broader institution to actually step back and say, what would be good for this situation? And so, if we turn around, if you think about what the paper is looking at, it's actually looking at people or citizens or would-be citizens and thinking of them as unwanted people. I'm talking very crassly here, but it's about unwanted lives, I think. It's unwanted lives. So a challenge that I think maybe sits behind this is to ask not what is the narrow appropriate medical response here, but from a kind of a religious perspective, it might say, what could be done in this context to turn what is right now being perceived or termed an unwanted life into a wanted life? And I think that this is actually something that is a curious thing in a lot of states. I guess I'm more familiar with like the states in the US about this, that sometimes the very states that make it hard to get access to abortion are the ones that also have the most punitive social welfare systems. And so it seems as though that whole challenge about what is the broader context here isn't being looked at. Which actually, see, I think that if you come back to the language of the resilient, where religiosity is interpreted mainly as spirituality, and the pursuit is of entering dialogue with let's say in this case, with a young person seeking an abortion, entering the dialogue seems to me to be, in fact, the way to get more of a kind of a win-win resolution here than a position that's taken by an organisation that has residual power from path dependency, and basically says we do this way or we don't do this way. So I think this is sort of interesting thing there about the mediated nature of discretion. In terms of questions for you, I wonder if there's a way to sort of cut through the categories a little bit more and to get a little bit more at the dilemmas that are faced by the doctors within the systems. And now I want to sort of put on my sort of like more like a reviewer kind of hat. You know, if I was reading this as a journal submission, what would I suggest? I wonder whether you might consider the possibility of actually turning this into two papers, one focused on abortion and one focused on end-of-life issues. Because I just think that it's quite, as it is, it's quite a lengthy paper. And I think that you could actually explore some of these dilemmas that we've been talking about quite effectively just by focusing on one of those. I think the two-country thing is fine, but I think doing that. The other thing about it, if you did it that way, you could actually publish the one paper, but in the process of getting it to publication level, you get insights that could then be applied to the second case. And plus you get two hits rather than one. So, so that could be quite good. But just finally here, yeah, I think I've covered off mainly what I wanted to do. It's that there's actually the question of the context framing and individual motivation that I think could potentially be brought out a little bit more here. So it's sort of how is the framing happening, and the fact of the Catholic Church having those resources versus, say, the Muslim community not. And I really appreciate you putting up the list of classic morality policies at the start there, because a question that I had is, suppose I believe every life is highly valued and nature should take its course, then what? But actually what's interesting is with something like assisted reproductive technology, it's like we're actually going to try to kind of kick-start life here. So there's some really interesting things. What does it mean for nature to take its course? It's like, so that's a very naive way of talking about it. But just to sort of say, I think you're really wrestling with some incredibly interesting stuff here. And I really like the way you're doing it and getting at some of these dilemmas. And my comments are really, in a sense, just around the margins of that.
Thank you very much. Our next presenter is Shannon Portillo.
Well, I just want to say, as this is coming up here, that I like to believe that we have a beautiful campus with gorgeous views, and that's what this is showing off, but it's nothing like what I've experienced here. So thank you for bringing us all here. I really appreciate it. Just by a way of framing, because I don't think that this comes across as a very traditional street-level bureaucracy or policy entrepreneurship piece, but I'm going to say that my career kind of took the opposite of what we heard from many yesterday, and that I very much started with street-level bureaucracy at my core. As a graduate student, I was a research assistant for Stephen Maynard Moody and was collecting a number of narratives that ended up being part of their work and pulled over from police officers. And one thing that kept sticking out to me is that as we're having these discussions about street-level bureaucrats and discretion and how that discretion impacted equity and identity for people served, we rarely talked about the identity of the bureaucrats themselves. We tended to talk about police officers as police officers, and that is their primary identity. So my work throughout my career has really looked at the social identities and the demographics of the bureaucrats themselves. I'm really interested in how race, gender, sexual orientation, and age shape our understanding of work within the workplace and how that then impacts the actions of bureaucrats within the organization. So I'm going to share a bit about a much broader project looking at the integration of women into combat forces in the military. I have no military background, but when I was approached to do this work starting 6 years ago, I found the military to be a really interesting organization. It's the largest public organization in the United States, and yet it's incredibly understudied from a public administration standpoint. So, as with all good research, everything that's good about it is because I had funding and an amazing research team, and everything that's bad about it is completely my fault and my fault alone. So, I want to provide a little overview of our research setting and some discussions of organizational resistance. I think this will tie back to some of the conversations we were having yesterday about not just policy change, but resistance to change when change doesn't happen. And then talk a bit about organizational justice, particularly procedural justice, and then mentoring as a mitigating factor there. So just a bit of kind of place setting here. So policy changes in the military, in the US military. There's historical evidence that women have participated in combat in the US military since the Revolutionary War, when there are accounts of women picking up weapons from fallen soldiers and fighting alongside men. However, it wasn't until World War II when there were specific policies about women being able to enter the armed services as the Auxiliary Nurses Corps. Immediately after World War II, women were all dismissed from the US military. It wasn't until 1948 that women were allowed to actually become a part of the permanent military, though they were not allowed to hold a rank higher than lieutenant and were not allowed to have command over a man. Obviously this has evolved over time. But in 1994, Congress put into place the direct ground combat exclusion policy, saying that while women could participate in all aspects of the military, they could not participate in direct combat within the military. Now, when we talk about kind of policy entrepreneurship and what was happening within the organization, immediately after this was put in place, women started suing the military and demanding their rights in court, as well as advocating within the organization, saying that being excluded from participating in combat meant that they would not be able to have the same job opportunities as other women within the organization. Those lawsuits never ended up really going that far because Congress ended up stepping in. And before anything else happened, in January of 2013, so I mean this did take a while for things to really happen, but then Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta rescinded the policy and began the process of integration. Fall of 2013, we began this research project. So we were in this really interesting in-between moment when the ground combat exclusion policy had been rescinded, but the combat branches of the military hadn't yet said how they were going to start integrating women into services. And so we were contacted by the Army Research Institute, and they were really interested in looking at special forces. So special forces is part of special operations within the Army. Special Forces deploys in small 12-person teams. And so these are small units that deploy, and they have a 2-year selection and training process before anyone actually gets into Special Forces and starts deploying with them. So typically, people are coming from other areas within the Army, they try out, and then train up and go and deploy with Special Forces. So in 2013, all of Special Operations across the branches of the military were trying to decide whether they were going to resist the policy change and say that women could still be excluded from Special Operations, or see if they were going to try to integrate women into the selection process for Special Forces. So we were interested in looking at 2 things. The first was task cohesion, the ability to do the work of the organization. Could women come in and do the same kind of work that men could do? Not necessarily from a physicality standpoint. There were very few people who said that women couldn't actually do the physical work, but could they do work in the small group setting of Special Forces? And then group cohesion, how the climate of the organization actually shifted when bringing women into the organization. Our goal was not a recommendation to the military. They funded some of the research and helped us collect the data. They wanted to know what we found. We don't do military work, so we were not about to tell them what to do. But we had wanted a broader understanding of the effects of gender integration into Special Forces. So for this particular paper, we're really looking at the idea of organizational resistance, so this idea of resistance to change. There are 2 common barriers to organizational change. One is the structural aspect. Much of this is dealt with through policy and practice within the organization, and the other is the cultural aspect. And one way that kind of those cultural pieces came up is gender stereotypes and some of the entrenched resistance to change within this organization. So we're using the idea of organizational justice to take a look at this. So much of this scholarship was developed in social psychology, going back to the 1970s, falling into 2 really broad categories: the idea of distributive justice, so outcomes of an organization, and the idea of procedural justice, or the processes that happen within an organization. We're really focusing in on procedural justice, so the idea that there are clear rules that people understand and know, and that there's a quality of experience that people have voice within the organization. In another paper, but I think it's very related, so I'm just going to throw it in here because, as I mentioned, this is part of a much broader project. We have a lot of data here. We're also looking at mentoring, and I think mentoring is one way to really get at some of these aspects of procedural justice. Do people understand both the written and unwritten norms of an organization? And then do they feel as though they have someone they can go to within the organization to help them navigate that? So, I don't know what just happened there. All right. For this project, we had a 2-stage design. We did focus groups. They were separated by rank when possible. We did a few pilot focus groups. We have a small group of special operations officers at KU, so we got to test out a bunch of our ideas on them before we went out into the field, which was awesome. Then we went to Fort Leavenworth, and then we had groups of men in Fort Carson, Fort Campbell, and Fort Lewis, and we had women at Fort Bragg. The women were all women who had been parts of small cultural support teams who deployed alongside special forces, and they were part of special operations, but not part of special forces. As I mentioned, we separated by rank when possible, and then we also had some groups with full special forces teams, those 12-person ODAs. We also had a really cool embedded experiment that I can tell you about later if you want. We had 4 researchers, 2 women, 2 men. The 2 men had prior military involvement, the 2 women, no military involvement. And we did some really interesting, we did an experiment where we had mixed facilitation groups and gender segregated facilitation groups, and we did find it made a difference. But the focus groups had major and consistent themes. We used those major and consistent themes to develop 2 surveys, one that went out to all active duty special forces men, and one that went out to all active duty women who had deployed alongside special forces in special operations. Both surveys had a response rate of around 28%, and we did some really fun structural equation modeling for this particular paper. So, we had 3 main hypotheses here. The first is that an increased perception of procedural justice decreases the perception that gender integration damages unit cohesion. So the idea that people believed that there was procedural justice within the organization meant that they also thought that women coming into the organization wasn't going to disrupt the work of the organization or the culture of the organization. I think the perceived procedural justice piece is really interesting here because at this particular time in 2013, women could not actually apply for these jobs and could not actually get these jobs. So there was no actual procedural justice. The procedures weren't fair or equitable. But if people believed that they were fair and equitable, our measures here mostly had to do with were promotion opportunities the same, was there fairness in selection, then people believed that gender equity was more possible within the organization. Hypothesis 2, increased perceptions of procedural justice reduce the prevalence of negative stereotypes of women. If people perceive that there is that procedural justice, they're less likely to hold negative stereotypes of women. And those negative stereotypes are what we saw embedded at that individual level, cultural level, and then policy and practice level in the organization. And then hypothesis 3, increases in perceived procedural justice indirectly reduce negative stereotypes of women by reducing the perception that gender integration damages group cohesion. So again, that idea that if we believe in the organization, then we actually think that women won't damage the work of the organization. All of these hypotheses held up and were statistically significant. This is one paper. In another paper, again, I was talking about that idea of mentoring. And what we found is that when people perceived that they had strong mentoring within the organization, they were more likely to think that gender integration was going to work out. I think that these concepts are pretty related in that if people think the organization functions well, then they can kind of handle that policy change a little bit better. One of the kind of drawbacks to that is that there are very few people who believed that they had strong mentors within the organization. Men were more likely to think that they had strong mentors than women in the organization, but few people overall thought that they had strong mentoring. But that mentoring, again, made that difference. So they could cope with the change of the organization more when they felt as though they had someone that they could help them navigate the formal and informal norms of the organization. So What we argue is that high perceptions of procedural justice buffer the potential negative effects of women integrating into this traditional male organization. This also buffers the organization from the impact of negative stereotypes about women and stereotypes that kind of infect the work of the organization. But what we argue is that organizational justice isn't just about policy, but the actual perceptions of these policies. As I mentioned, these data were all collected at a time when these policies weren't actually in place yet, and so there was no real kind of concept of procedural justice, but if people believed in it, then they seemed to be more okay with the idea of it moving forward. Thank you very much.
I would like to hear our discussant, Peter Yup.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, thank you, Sharon, for this presentation about a very nice paper on an understudied subject. You're quite right. I mean, if there are any street-level bureaucrats, you would say we are talking about soldiers. But it's amazing how few studies have been done as far as people like you know, researching soldiers as street-level bureaucrats. So I think it's very important what you are doing with your colleagues. And I appreciate it a lot. I have 3 questions, Mr. Chairman. 3 questions. As I say, your topic is very relevant. I see potentially contributions to 3 scholarly themes: justice and equity, representative bureaucracy, and street-level bureaucracy. And my question is, to what scholarly theme do you want to contribute first and foremost? Very straightforward question. First question. The second question is about accountability. We have been talking about accountability regimes, and Irina did so too just a few minutes ago. I think it's important to look at professional accountability when you are studying the kind of things you are interested in, Shannon. You could imagine that when a combat unit consists, let's say, for the half of men and for the half of women, that is, well, having an effect on cohesion, group cohesion, task cohesion, but perhaps also it has an effect on accountability interaction. And my question is, how do you incorporate this accountability aspect in your analysis? That was my second question. And then I have a third question. You are talking, and I like what you are doing, you are talking about a mixed methods design. You have a focus group and surveys especially. But my question is, in fact, how mixed is your design? I mean, we all know that people may say S and they act doing D. I mean, we all know that, and that is one of the nice things you have found also, that when people believe that is important, but that does not say anything about what is happening in fact. So my question is very simple. Do you have considered the possibility of other methods like participant observation, vignette methods, and so on? These were my 3 questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Do you want to answer?
Do
We
we
have
have
2 minutes, yeah?
Yeah. Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay. Well, I actually, that first question I find fascinating, that idea of which stream of literature, because I get very frustrated as a scholar that we have these very separate streams, because I think in particular we shouldn't separate out questions of equity from anything else that we're studying. And so I think that it's incredibly important to me in my work to say that I never want to contribute to street level bureaucracy theory without also considering questions of equity representative bureaucracy, we can get into a very long, complicated discussion, because I think that most of our research is representative bureaucracy. We just forget that most of what we represent is whiteness in bureaucracy. And so most of the representative bureaucracy literature doesn't account for that. But I think that these should be more integrated, not kind of more specific, but that gets really complicated and I'm not sure I know how to do it well, so.
Well, I would like to entirely agree with you, but the fact is, Paul is sitting here. I mean, we have to do with journals and so on. So, well, but you're right.
Yeah, you can contribute to different streams in the same paper.
Yeah.
But you have to make it clear.
So I think that first and foremost it would probably then be that equity piece, but then how do we weave that into the other streams of our work? Accountability is a really broad and interesting question in this scholarship, and to be fair, I don't think that we have a lot of great kind of questions or measures around accountability in this particular project, because what we were most interested in is studying what did people perceive, how do people perceive a potential change? And so that change hadn't yet happened, and while now it's 6 years later and some of that has started to happen, we don't know what the effects really are yet. So I think that accountability piece and how we think about accountability in this space, both from kind of a cohesion and cultural standpoint, and then also from the task standpoint, is really interesting, and I think that should be an important follow-up study that we don't yet have. One thing that I think was interesting is that in those focus groups we did ask about how other policy changes had shaped both task cohesion and unit cohesion, particularly rescinding Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and then what happened. So people had a lot of strong perceptions before that change, and then what was the actual kind of on the ground behavioral change, and it was largely a, oh yeah, nothing changed. Everything stayed exactly. Turns out that we all knew that there was this one soldier, and you know, he's a soldier, everything's fine. And so I think that idea of what happens post-policy change from an accountability standpoint is still a very big, broad, open question.
Maybe we will leave that for the...
Sure, then we can talk about methods
Yeah, of course.
even more.
Okay, so we will move on to the next and last presenter. We welcome Neva Golanabe.
Hi, good morning everyone. My name is Neva. I'm very happy to be here today, especially taking a few hours leave from my maternity leave. The study I'm going to talk about today is a part of my postdoctoral fellowship here at the University of Haifa with Nissim Cohen. It was also co-authored with Dr. Aviad Rubin. And it focuses on the case of Israel, how the street-level bureaucrats' discretion leads to alternative supply of public services. We're going to talk about marriage. Okay, my first on the right. Okay. So Israel was established as a Jewish and democratic state. So by definition, Israel does not separate state and religion. With state establishment, 4 core topics were determined to be led by the Jewish halakha, the Jewish conduct. It is the Shabbat, the kashrut, the kosher food, marriage, and education, among other topics, but these are the core ones. State institution that was declared to be the manager and has the monopoly on regulating and managing these religious affairs is the chief rabbinate. When reviewing these topics, marriage really stands out. And this is because despite the fact that marriage services are provided by the chief rabbinate of Israel, for the past 2 decades, we have a civil society organization which supplies alternative marriage services. Why did it happen? Why do we have an organization supplying alternative marriage services? When looking on publications in mass media, we see that there is quite a problematic issue with the registrars of the rabbinate. They are very difficult towards the couples that come to register. We see that they have blacklists. What are blacklists? Lists determining that some people in Israel cannot get married religiously. This is because their Jewishness, their Jewish identity is in question, according to these registrars. One very interesting development recently is that some registers are actually asking the couples to take a DNA test to find out if they are Jewish or not. Of course, it is very, it takes time, it's very expensive, it is very problematic. So the hardship is something that keeps coming up and causing people not to go, not even get married because of the problematic hardship. Now, the Office of Religion and Religious Affairs has published data on the couples that register. And they're indicating that last year in 2018, there was a roughly 6% decrease in registering couples. Even the prior year, it has been a decrease of roughly 5%. Now, if the rabbinate would have taken under consideration the number of couples who they do marry religiously, but they use the alternative registration services provided by this civil society organization, it would be a roughly 20% decrease in using the rabbinical services, which are, again, a state monopoly. So, who is this civil society organization? The Tzor Rabbis organization is an NGO. It was established in 1995, and it provides alternative religious marriage registration. It's important to indicate the religious registration, because it is state policy. They work in accordance to state law, but they do it privately. Their motivation as their official website, and of course as their officials, which I interviewed, declare, is that over 30% of Israel's secular couples wish to avoid the bureaucratic encounter with their registrars. Not only people are not getting married because it is very difficult to go through the process, but they don't even go there because they're really afraid of what's going to happen. They marry approximately 5,000 couples per year, which is roughly 20% of the people getting married in Israel every year. So, going to theory. The Tzor organization is in fact an alternative supplier of public services. And when does alternative supply occur? It occurs when, according to Albert Hirschman's classic theory, when citizens are disappointed with existing policy, but they cannot exit the policy because it is a monopoly and they cannot really voice their demands, again, because of the monopoly. And then the dissatisfied citizens are finding alternative channels to provide these services. They can, citizens may supply the alternative services, but also civil society organizations can do so, and we're focusing on civil society organizations. Most studies do focus on citizens, by the way. The contribution of this study is mainly here. We are not talking about policy as designed, but street level implementation. The alternative supply occurs not because people are dissatisfied with the policy. We're talking about the implementation of these bureaucrats that causes these alternative supply. And this is exactly what the Tzor Rabbis organizations are declaring, because these registers cannot do the work correctly. They're not, they're intoxicated with power of the monopoly, so this is what they do. Going to connect alternative supply with street level bureaucracy and discretion, we're talking about these street level officials, which have much power, and their power is within their discretion. They do have the policy and they do have the pillars, but they have much latitude in the middle to decide how they want to implement the policy, and in marriage they have a considerable discretion here in Israel. Their discretion is affected by their environment, by the organizational context, and by their own personality, by their ideological beliefs. And this is one of our goals. We wanted to understand what affects their discretion that causes the citizens, their clients, dissatisfaction. So the research question we ask is, under what conditions street-level bureaucrats' discretion leads civil society organization to establish alternative supply channels of public goods and services? We claim, our hypothesis is that the combination of street-level bureaucrats' monopoly over how policy is implemented create the inability of clients to exit, as described in Hirschman's theory. People cannot get married otherwise because the chief rabbinate has the monopoly. Block participation channels, creating the inability for them to use voice that changes street-level bureaucrats' practices. It's very individual. Discretion is not something you can find a general rule about. And the dissatisfaction of citizens with the outcomes of the implementation practices. The combination of these three will prompt civil society organizations to create alternative supply channels of public services. Now, we've conducted a qualitative research. We've used 20 in-depth interviews along with text analysis of primary and secondary sources. What we're trying to find out is what are the factors that influence this societal dissatisfaction with street-level bureaucrats' discretion. We've found at the individual level, organizational level, and environmental level altogether gives us quite an understanding and why citizens are dissatisfied with the discretion. So, shortly, on the personal level, we have found that the registrar's worldview is a very important factor in their discretion. It was very interesting to find just how they perceive the concept of discretion. They have many gray areas in the policy, so they can use their own personal views in order to implement it. We find that the registrars make their decisions on the spot. They can look at a couple and decide one thing and then differently within a different couple. The range of their decision making, they can intervene with the date you're setting or the venue you're choosing, if it's kosher or not, but then they go to Jewishness affirmation. They can really say you are not Jewish in accordance to halacha, and then you cannot get married if you're not conducting a process, you're not going to your home in Ukraine and find in your city showing us documentation showing us that you're Jewish. And of course, the professional ideological stream. The rabbinate registrars are ultra-Orthodox people, and they're very different from the Tzohar rabbis, which are moderate Zionist rabbis. This is also affecting how they treat different communities, Ethiopian communities in Israel, and former Russian immigrants, how they perceive them. The second one is the organizational level. The street-level bureaucrats, the registrars, are very affected with the zeitgeist of their managing rabbis' worldview. It really sets the tone on the religious council. It is the local religious council. They are criticized by the Tzohar rabbis that they are just the work. It is a mean to make a living rather than a true belief, trying to help people, trying to get them closer to the Jewish belief. And then we found that the younger managing rabbis, they served in the Israeli army, they are closer to modern times, and then they are much more accepting for other people. And then you can see that the Tel Aviv local council has become, because of its managing rabbi, which is very young and moderate, has even opened a Facebook page They open an internet registration services. They're really advancing. And then the last and final environmental level, we're talking about culture and we're talking about politics. If a city is more orthodox demographically, and then of course the registrars are much stricter in their implementation rather than in more secular cities. And then of course it affects the communities, the immigrants communities in these cities. And local politics, different mayors have considerable influence on the councils, and if they're more religious affiliated, then of course the hardship will increase. The registrars, by the way, are accused of being political appointments, and this is exactly why their discretion is affected by the political forces on them. So to conclude, street-level bureaucrats' discretion does not only impact directly their clients, but it can also indirectly cause the alternative supply of the services by creating civil society organizations providing it. Alternative politics services may be formed due to dissatisfaction, not just of policy as designed, but policy implementation. The dissatisfaction of citizens from street-level bureaucrats' practices are not just influenced by one factor, but the combination of the three presented. And this theoretical approach may be implemented in other policy areas in other democratic countries, which is important for me to state because comparing to other Western democracies, Israel does not separate state and religion. This does not mean it cannot be a paradigmatic case. Thank you.
And we are keen to hear our discussant, Eduardo Ramirez, de la Cruz.
Eva, it was a very good paper. I enjoyed very much reading it. And the presentation was also very good because it really summarized the idea of the paper. However, I need to give you some ideas for how to improve the paper, so I'm going to concentrate on that part. The first one, you're right. I mean, this can appeal to a broader audience. As it is now, it appeals to some that will have this conflict between church and the government. So first, I think it will benefit if you tell us what you get when you get married. I mean, for instance, like in Mexico, if you get married through the civil law, then you can get access to civil services, benefits if your partner gets sick, I mean, things like that. So what do you get here? Because then it's not clear why some people choose just not to get married and live together. So that's one thing. So if you explain that will be probably more opinion. The other thing is you somehow it portrays like two types of bureaucrats. Some that are the going by the book bureaucrats, right? Those that try to protect their beliefs by going by the book, and others that are more entrepreneurial, the ones that work in the private sector. So, but I want to know if the first ones are accountable or see themselves accountable to a different audience. Like they say, it's not for me, it's not my job to give the benefit of marriage to people, but to protect the religion or to protect the purity of the religion. And then you have different stories, because some are being entrepreneurial, but for different purposes. So that's something that you will need to clarify, I think, in the paper. Other thing is that you have in your data the ones but not the zeros. Like, there are still people, because from my understanding, you interview people that didn't went through the register, like the government register, but went through this alternative registration. So what happened, or why some people, even though they have all this hazard to going through the government registration, they still go through that. So what makes them to go through the process, even though they shouldn't, for all the reasons that you are telling us? So then we will have a better way of comparing these two populations. So why some go? I mean, you still have like 80%, 70% going through the regular. So why would they go to that? It's not clear to me. And you're right. I mean, at the end of the paper, you mentioned this idea of this happening in other countries with other perks, like clearly in many countries, private education. So why people go and pay private education and doesn't go to the regular education? So this kind of example, or your example, can speak to a broader audience if you compare why people choose to go to this alternative provider of public services. And when I started reading the paper, my expectation was to learn more about why the history of this SOHAR organization, why it was created, who created it. I mean, because to me, those are the entrepreneurs, the ones that decide to create an entire organization outside the system to provide the services. So why, how, that the history of this group will be very interesting for me to read. And so, but those are some ideas just about how to improve the paper, mainly to speak to a broader audience. But the rest is good. I like the analysis. I like what I see we delivered. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we had very good presentations. We got a few more minutes from our manager, Nathan. So I'll open the stage for your questions and comments. Please try to be specific and yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, can I ask Shannon a question about the two questions, about one about the hypothesis and the other one about sort of the where are the institutions in the hypothesis, because the hypothesis seem to revolve around sort of individual traits. If you have trait A, then you're likely to behave B, whatever that B is. However, I was looking at the hypothesis, you had them up there, and it looks like 1 and 3 are directly related in that 3 is exactly the same other than the indirect effect that you have over there. So if all of them are, as you said, if all of them are confirmed, are the effects direct or are the effects indirect? Because one hypothesis is indirect, the other one direct. The second question has to do with the institutions. I am sure there are differences depending on sort of your background, especially among women who haven't had the chance to participate in special forces. Where do they come from and how have they been acculturated, and therefore that, to an extent, I assume, determines their perceptions of justice or not.
If you don't mind, we will collect a couple of questions and comments.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
If it's all right, I have a question for Eva.
Yeah, it's okay.
Very interesting paper. I was fascinated by what I read. I don't know much yet about Israel, and it's really fascinating. You started with this crucial sentence, I would say, about the not having a separation between religion and state, if I'm correct. So we are talking about the rabbi as the ultimate street level bureaucrat. And my question is, to what extent can your findings be turned back, brought back to that fundamental situation that the state in Israel is so much has a kind of more or less religious character. You see what I mean? I mean, that's very fundamental, I would say. It's a context factor. But I would say it can explain a lot of what you have found.
Think about it. Tony?
Yeah, fascinating, really interesting piece. I was interested in two aspects. One, the reference to Scott. So does that seem like a state?
Sorry?
You make a reference on the PowerPoint to Scott, 1977.
Okay.
I was wondering if that was seen like a state.
No, I don't think so.
Oh, right, sorry, right. Well, because there were, like in seeing like a state, Scott.
No, it was
Right. Right. Because I just thought it was
The assessing determinants.
Right. I won't go that way then. The other point was, in terms of thinking about policy isn't just paper, it's about personnel as well. Levin talks about this. And in terms of who is actually in this position of power, you talk about the role of, say, cities in determining who is the registrar. So I think one of the problems sometimes with street level bureaucracy analysis is that it looks at what happens on the ground and says, well, it's all the fault of that person on the ground. But the person has been appointed, you're saying, because of their particular sort of religious bent. So in Tel Aviv, it's more liberal. In more ultra-Orthodox areas, the registrar will reflect that community's perspective. So I think there's something there about the way in which that discretion is actually constructed through who is appointed by political actors.
Okay, Dana?
I have a comment and a question. First comment is a connection, just the Israeli context again of the two papers, because in Israel, the issue of bringing girls into the army is actually a religious one. It's how can you have in the same small 12-people unit the men and the women together from a religious aspect? So that's just combining those issues together. My second question is to you, Shannon. I sort of really like to see proper data and a quantitative study, but the question has to do with the fact that it could be, since there's sort of the same person giving you your dependent and independent variable, is it just that if I'm a non-biased kind of person, then I'll perceive my organization as procedurally justice and also not be very biased towards women? Like, if you thought about it and if you have any ways to control for that.
Okay.
Collecting more questions? Okay, so I think that kind of connects back to Peter's question about methodology, because I do think that's a really interesting one, and I will say that there is a whole research team on this project, and I am not the quantitative,
I've seen
qualitative
that, but we
data.
didn't see any graphs.
Yeah, exactly. I would just tell you all about our focus groups all day if I could, but that wasn't the paper that I was working on. So, but I think that what I can say is that a lot of what came out of the focus groups was this idea of, and this is trying to kind of tie in that experience that women had, because the women that we were speaking with both in the focus groups and for the survey were women who had deployed alongside special forces in special operations. So they were women who had the closest approximation to that experience, though not the same experience as far as selection and things like that. The overall, in the surveys, what we found is that the vast majority of men didn't want women to be integrated. And the vast majority of women did think that women should be able to be integrated. But then when we were kind of drilling down, looking at this idea of non-bias, I'm not really sure what the answer is to your question of, could it just be that people who aren't biased then see women as think that the organization is less biased and so then would be more accepting of women being in there. But I think that does potentially get to the direct and indirect effects of directly if people think that there's a lack of bias in the organization, they may be more accepting of organizational change. But that indirect effect of seeing gender stereotypes as lessening of gender stereotypes means that there was still some way in which stereotypes are playing out in the organization. And so I think those stereotypes do get embedded in the ways that people think about policies and practices overall. And so some of the ways that this was coming about, I mean, some of just the really interesting pieces out of the qualitative data were that people were thinking about the same policy in vastly different ways. So we ended up talking about bathrooms and hygiene more than I ever thought imaginable in a research study. But
And it's so I can tell you that it's a matter.
It's a real matter.
Well, and many of the men in our study kept bringing up this policy that said that women can't be in the field for more than 3 days. And so they're like, this just means that it doesn't matter, that women just can't be in the field for more than 3 days, so they can't be on these ODA, the special operations teams are called ODAs. They can't be on these ODAs because they'll have to go back and have a real shower. And so it's not actually about their sexism, it's about showers. And so it's really just about showers. And then finally, after all these focus groups, so women brought in the actual policy, and she said, has anybody read the policy? And I said, no, we're not actually policy scholars here. I just want to hear what you think about the policy. But she said, no, the policy says you have to have access to privacy and hygiene. That's a baby wipe in a bush. So you can have a baby wipe in a bush out in the field, it's perfectly fine. You don't have to go back to a base in any way. But the ways in which they were talking about kind of their interpretations of these policies became really interesting and really ingrained with kind of the, not only the idea of stereotypes about hygiene and women's ability in organizations, but also then how those played out in the practices of what people really thought could happen regardless of policies about gender equity.
I'm curious whether if in the focus groups it came up that the men within the groups felt that their masculine self-image is threatened by the presence of women within this unit.
So we didn't ask directly about masculinity, but in many of the focus groups it became very clear that men were using the idea of women as what masculinity isn't. And so they were saying that special forces is about, I mean, they would very directly say special forces is about being an alpha male, being hyper-masculine, and so here are the things that women are not. And so women were very much used as a foil to say what masculinity wasn't, and so saying that that's how they couldn't kind of integrate culturally into these spaces. So masculinity did come up quite a bit, but more than defining what masculinity was, they would use women to define what masculinity was not.
Nina, do you want to reply?
Yes, of course. Okay, so first of all, thank you for the comments. I would actually want to begin with the question of why do people go through with it? Why do they go to the chief rabbinate? Okay, so the hardship I was describing, it escalated along the years. It wasn't always that severe. So this is one. One should not ignore tradition. Israelis, in most part, are very traditional. And this is the reason why when you get married in Israel, it is, of course, it is even natural. It seems natural that you go and marry religiously. The rabbi, he has rabbi jokes, and then you're embarrassed under the chuppah. And it's tradition, it's very Israeli, and this is what you do. So changing tradition is something that, of course, takes time. And people are still not there. They still go to the rabbinate. By the way, it's also lack of information. Not everyone know about the Tzua Rabbi organization, and this really takes me to what makes people even not choose other alternatives. But I want to really focus. This paper is only about religious marriage. because if we want to talk about alternatives to the official policy, and I'm not talking in this paper about policy, I'm talking about implementation. If we're talking about policy, then people dissatisfied with the official religious policies are going to the courts, they're going to common law marriage, and by the way, Israel is actually very, very generous with rights and obligations, and people that are common law spouses have equal rights to religiously married couples. So this is to put aside, but people that do want religion can go to find alternative registration and alternative modern rabbis, which is something that is it really peaked in the recent years. Now, it is true, it makes two populations of street level bureaucrats, because we have the chief rabbinate ones, which are, I can recall that one told me they think they are the shield of religion. They are actually they care more about protecting religion and halakha rather than caring about the population, the citizens, their clients, about their welfare. It was exactly described this way. And the Torah rabbis come and say, okay, we want to be friendly. And the reason we want to do it, because we don't want to lose Jewish people from going and getting married in Cyprus in a civil marriage. We want to keep them here. We want them to still marry as Jews, but they can do it in a friendly manner, not like the chief rabbinate decision. I do accept to elaborate on Zohar's historical process of creation. And last, Tony's comment, thank you. I think that your comment is exactly what makes the three factors to overlap. Because if a street level bureaucrat is a political appointment, it is both because of the environment is operating within, but then again it's also his personal religious affiliation, worldviews that makes his decision to match the political atmosphere where he provides services. So thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Irina, you will be our last speaker.
Yeah. No, but basically, I have just a small comment to what Michael said, and I think it's not clear in our paper, and we should make that clear. We're not focusing on policy implementers, we're not focusing on doctors, but we're focusing on religious actors. But I do think, so that, let's say, work aside or against doctors, right, in the process of implementation. Of course, that their influence, de facto influence, within the broader scope of these policies is very low, because in the end, the policy clients do not have to talk to them, basically. But what we're trying to rather see here is a framework for explaining religious actors' engagement, and that can enter in dialogue with other approaches for religious actors and so on. But I do think that our framework could also explain doctors' repertoire, but maybe there you have to add another accountability regime, which is the professional one, which I think is a very strong one. So that would be the change. And about Niva's paper, I think that actually, I don't know to what extent Israel can be a paradigmatic case for. There are church-state regimes in Europe that does not separate religion from state, and that is Scandinavian. That is the UK, Norway, and Sweden until 2002, and I think Finland, I'm not sure. So Scandinavian countries, basically, you have the same situation, and religious marriage is actually civil marriage, and I'm not sure actually if there is the alternative route just of civil marriage, so outside the Protestant church in these cases. But maybe it is an interesting and paradigmatic case for how gay marriages are conducted within these countries, because I think you would not encounter this situation in these countries with church-state regime, but you do encounter a lot of discretion on the ground regarding Protestant churches marrying gay couples. and therefore it would be like a sort of mirroring kind of situation. Would be interesting to compare it.
Good point. Okay, thank you very much, everybody.
So we'll take 15 minutes and we'll be back here in 10:55. If that sounds reasonable?
Political appointment.
So good morning. I apologize for being late, although I have to do business. And very pleasant and thanks Lisa for the invitation. And shall we go on with the second panel this morning of current trends in policy and entrepreneurship research and its implications. So first, Edgar Ramirez de la Cruz, and then discuss and mine. So each person 10 to 12 minutes, and then 5 minutes for discussion.
Good.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I think, Naomi, thank you very much for everything. So I'm gonna go quickly through my 40 slides full of text, and let me tell you why those many slides with full of text. Because I don't have a paper yet, but this is the outline for the paper. So, I'm gonna try to go quickly. So when I was telling you that yesterday I was shopping for a concept to explain one of the variables that it's missing in my studies, it was true. I'm looking for a variable that will explain, because in a previous studies to explain the adoption of in the policy process, I used what some colleagues and I call the political market. Framework. Basically, in order to explain the adoption of policies or the adoption of land use regulation in cities, we can focus on different variables. The first one will be, it's called the property rights. And basically it says that cities respond to problems by adopting policies or by building infrastructure. So we have a traffic congestion, and then we build, the city builds a light rail to deal with traffic. So this idea is that cities are like rational entities that respond to problems. And we call the property right problem because it tries to protect the value of properties and the right to have access to services. The other common hypothesis that explains this is the interest groups. And this basically says that there are some groups interested in the outcomes of policies in cities, and cities will respond to these groups depending on how powerful they are. So the most common hypothesis is the Moloch and Logan and Moloch hypothesis of the growth machine. Cities basically grow. They build infrastructure just because that promotes economic development, and that will benefit almost everyone in the community, except the current residents. The current residents usually are referred as the NIMBYs, or not in my backyard. So they don't want some new infrastructure if they will affect the value of the properties or their quality of life. So this hypothesis will complement with what we call the political markets that concentrates on the political institutions. And basically that will say that there are some rules of the game in the decision making in the city that will amplify the power of some groups. For instance, territorial groups will benefit by district elections because that will help them to get their preferred policies when they can elect a representative in their area, in their city, that will represent their benefit. On the other hand, at-large elections, those elections that happen in the entire district of a city, that will benefit the pro-growth interest because they will not help to provide these preferred policies to small groups, territorial groups. However, I believe that in this literature we are missing an important piece. And this important piece are policy entrepreneurs. And these policy entrepreneurs can be public officials or can be politicians, I mean elected or unelected officials, but also just civilians willing to invest their time and money in order to advance different policies. And this is overlooked mainly by the political market framework. We have two cases of infrastructure in Mexico City. Mexico City is the largest city in Mexico. It's about 18 million people, 18, 20 million people. And that's just the city. Outside the city, there are over 5, 6 million people. And we studied two cases, the Chapultepec corridor and as a highway system. I'm going to go quickly through, we conducted a grounded analysis of semi-structured interviews, 28, 14 for each case, of public officials, elected and non-elected, and also just activists or civilians that participate in this project, at least in the opposition to this project. The first one is the corridor of Chapultepec, which basically was, I have a picture. This is one of the main streets. Well, it's just the
Artists ready to move.
Exactly. So basically, this is one of the most congested cities in Mexico that goes from Chapultepec Park to the center. And if you see here, there is a highway. So what they wanted to do is to cover the highway with shops and nice green areas, and let the cars go inside. And this was an important project of the government. Was about 1.1 million, 1 billion pesos. Oh, it sounds a lot, but it's 19 pesos per dollar. So it's not that much, but still it's plenty of money. So this faces opposition by some very visible interest groups and people that we can point out in the media in the city. And basically they use, there is a rule for non-binding consultation that cities have to organize in order to approve large development projects like this one. So they push for this non-binding election or consultation. It was yes or not on that. Only the people in the affected direct area participate or were allowed to participate, and the no won.
Why did they not want it?
That's they mainly allegate that it was affecting historic areas of the city. That was one of the arguments, and the other one was about gentrification that will be the result of this. So that was the two main arguments used. The other one was this corridor. It's a highway system that about the same budget, and it was promoted by the cities, and it was trying to cut the commute from 40 to 5 minutes in one area of the city. So yeah, it's horrible to live in that city, really. I mean, it's a 2 hours commute to anywhere you want to go. But you're welcome to visit. Okay, so there was a corridor. It also faced opposition, but the opposition was about the number of trees that were going to be cut. About 1,500 trees, all trees, in a very polluted city. So that was what the opposition wanted. But here the government reacted very quickly to this demand. In the first, they were claiming here that they already had planted 1,000 new trees to make that with that. The opposition also tried to push for this non-binding consultation. However, they didn't produce enough support for this. So in the end, the government, this was the secretary of government in the city. She was one of the interviewees for the project. This is the mayor. The mayor announced that the project was going anyway. Another reason why they wanted to stop it was because of flooding. This highway is on a river, or in an old river. So that was another reason why they opposed that. And that was right. As soon as it was open, it was flooded. Anyway, so let me just go quickly to the findings. So about the framing. The Chapultepec corridor, the one that was stopped, was framed about historic preservation. So they claimed that they were affecting historic areas of the city, and the framing of the other was about protecting the environment. On the one that was stopped, the Chapultepec corridor, the group that participated had previous experience trying successfully and unsuccessfully to stop other decisions in the city, like putting meters in some areas or building within parks. 1 minute. Okay. The allies in one were planners and urban planners, and in others were architects and biologists. So, which one was less successful? Architects and biologists in protecting. The reputation seemed to be very important. Reputation about being reasonable. The ones in the Chapultepec were being reasonable, not just opposing everything. And the timing. That's basically some had better timing. Just quickly through what I think are the preliminary findings. One is that good allies. Why urban planners were better allies than urban planners and lawyers were better allies than architects and engineers? Basically, because this helped because the mayor is elected at large. They have broader networks in the city that will help them to promote their interests outside the affected area. How the frame was done, it's very important because in the absence of at-large elections, something that will be appealing to the entire city will be more important than something that appeals to just the neighborhood, like the trees in this case. This is very important because last year we elected we broke the city into 18 municipalities. So now I think that territorial arguments will be more appealing because they will appeal to the mayor of that area, not just to one. So that's how we see the interaction so far of institutions with entrepreneurs. So the best entrepreneurs are the ones that understand the rules of the game.
Thank you. So, shall we go straight to the discussion and then,
Sure. Thank you, Edgar. This was interesting, very interesting for me, and I hope for the rest of the workshop participants, partly because I know nothing about urban studies, so I learned something, and every time I learn something, it's interesting. So check plus on that. I think your paper will also have wide appeal as a topic, partly because you're dealing with an area where some of these things are not where some of these things have not been discussed. So sort of you're merging different fields, if you like. And now for some, that's for the good stuff. Now for ways to improve the paper. I think one of the issues, sort of the main issue that I had was you include theories that are unfortunately, I think, not terribly well related to what exactly you're trying to do. For example, the minute you started talking about your dependent variable, I started thinking about policy process theories, yet I heard nothing from the theoretical perspective of those things. What I would do is sort of revisit some of the writings that I have, make the political market stuff more of sort of the lit review, and then make the originality of the paper as, let me tell you now, all you urban planning people, about the policy process, because these are good theories. And as I was hearing you talk, I thought of advocacy coalition framework. That's one option that you may wish to throw in. The other one could be sort of the multiple streams. When you were talking about framing and how they were framing the issue, that's what came to my mind too. So I would urge you to think theoretically about how these kinds of concepts can help you address the question that you have. The information is there. It just needs to be sort of reconceptualized and refined in that direction. The second thing that I would suggest to you is please have some hypotheses. They give you direction, and they help your reader understand where it is you're driving at and what to expect and what not to expect. And depending on the theory, could be a comparative piece between two different frameworks. Let's see which one works better. It could be one, and let's refine sort of that because we're transporting it into a new environment of applicability that was not applied before. I mean, whatever the case might be. And sort of you can end the study with number one, what can you say about the theories of the policy or the theory, whatever that is. Not so much whether entrepreneurs are important, we know that, but in what ways are they important? And what have we learned about entrepreneurs, if that's what you want to hang your hat on, so to speak? In what ways are they important that we didn't know before? Does sort of the urban environment make them act differently? Perhaps. And the second thing would be, the second hook, if you like, would be what do you say now to the sort of urban studies literature that they don't already know? Other than, sure, there are policy entrepreneurs. Yeah. Well, what more? In what ways does your study improve on things that they have said, and how can you nuance or qualify some of the arguments that they have made that makes your study a very interesting and original one and bring something to that literature. So you're talking to two literatures, but your main literature, in my opinion, would be, depending on how you want to frame your theory, it would be sort of the policy studies, the policy process people. And sort of the urban planning or the urban studies would be sort of the secondary audience. That's it. That's the pearls of wisdom.
So we go next to Alex Ingray, and then my colleague Dr. Naz, they're going to talk to us about the policy entrepreneurship in development. It's
Well, thanks, Sharon, for this very perfect pronunciation of my name, and it's always a challenge. And thank you for Nissim and Naomi for organizing such a fascinating event, and I truly appreciate it. So today, basically, I'm going to talk in the capacity of both a researcher and a journal editor. So from that perspective, so this is basically another stock-taking exercise, after Michael's fantastic job yesterday. And so I'm, as I told you, I'm a journal editor of Journal of Asian Public Policy. And this small journal is not even never getting closer to Paul's journal, but we do well in studies in related to Asia, and do it with participation of lots of like Michael, and we're getting even stronger. So what I'm going to do is to share with you some of the the progress I'm currently working on, the two research actual publication projects I'm currently leading. One is with Daryl Jarvis and Paul Collins, that is a special issue plan in PAD, and we frame it in the context of policy entrepreneurship in developing countries, per se. And then another is with Michael and Diamora, and then that is basically look at policy entrepreneurship in the Asian context. What motivated us to do so is because if you look at the literature, policy entrepreneurship is predominantly Western context, right? And then the sort of knowledge from other contexts, non-Western contexts, as Michael rightly pointed out, is very limited. Later on, I'll show you that you can see how thin that body of literature is. And because of the sort of narrow scope, the narrow context, have some sort of, limited the explanatory power and the generalizability of the theories. So we have, we pursue these two projects with quite high theoretical ambition. So these are the list of those adapted and under revision papers, including a very fascinating paper done by Nissim and Naomi. And you can see that, this truly covers a very wide range of national contexts. For example, China, India, Thailand, Indonesia, and Ghana, African country. So, and it really, this basket of papers really deals with lots of, policy issues like the energy, environment, and so on and so forth. And then you look at the literature of PE, so actually, to share with you a story, PE refers to policy entrepreneurship, we know it. And a couple of months ago, I organized a departmental research seminar. So I threw out an announcement PE, and then somehow lots of sports major students came to my classroom, and they said, well, what are you doing here? And that moment I forgot that my university is an education university, so physical education students came here. So PE has become a very powerful analytical concept. By the way, it's not a theory, as we already talked about yesterday. It's a basically organizing concept. It's an explanatory concept in policy process studies. It started from multiple streams model, but now it has been quite successfully embedded into other major theoretical frameworks such as punctuated equilibrium and a advocacy collision theory framework and so on. So at the beginning, it started from a model explaining agenda setting, but now, as we already talked about yesterday, it has truly gone beyond the agenda setting. But now you can see empirical study in basically every stage of the policy cycle model, in particular policy implementation. So this is part of the reason why street level bureaucrats can actually play a role, because predominantly, if you look at the policy implementation literature, bureaucrats are oftentimes portrayed as the source of policy distortion, self-interest, too much administrative discretion, and then implementation deficit. So the idea, the value of this particular workshop is to look at them from a more constructive way. They can actually constructively, participate in policy-making process other than, that what we already know about the top, bottom-up feedback channel. So the scope of policy entrepreneurship has also, gone beyond, like advisors, advocates. And if you look at the literature of IR, quite interesting that oftentimes even sovereign countries in the studies of IR has been used, portrayed as policy entrepreneurs, and so on and so forth. So the national context and policy domains have also expanded from Western democracies to non-Western democracies, authoritarian states, low-income countries, and so on and so forth. So environment, healthcare, education, so the sectoral domain has also, really increased. So here I want to highlight, a literature survey. One of them was done by Nissim and Naomi, and the other by Shana Baker. And they have actually done a quite interesting literature survey looking at what types of studies and what are the approaches and what are the analytical focuses, are those studies related to developing countries. And of course, the sample size varies according to the way they collect data. But overall, you can see that the picture is very much qualitatively driven. So very few quantitative efforts, And then predominantly, it strikes me that 1/3 of the studies, based in developing countries, actually have no clear methodological, approach. So many of them are simply case studies, highly descriptive, highly interpretive. And single case study design are the dominant categories. So 70% of them are single case study designs without even some sort of comparison. And then you look at national context, China obviously accounts for the majority of the studies, and followed by India and Turkey and so on. So environment, social welfare, are quite popular areas of analysis. And then there are lots of opportunities. We look at why we pursue these two special issue projects is because developing countries, developing world is truly a very fertile soil for the exploration of policy entrepreneurs, because we have a very wide variety range of political systems, right? And then including communist regimes and so on and so forth. And the culture is very so socioeconomic status. So this actually provides quite good, opportunity for comparative study, but unfortunately, these efforts, are very few. And then in the developing countries, in China, in India, in Southeast Asian countries, there are a very big number of public sector reforms, and some are successful, some are failures. So these provides actually opportunity for comparative analysis, and as Nikos, rightly pointed out, that much of the analysis, much of the literature focuses on, how successful they were and why they were successful, but very little is known as to how these PEs, actually defended the status quo. That is also should be included into our agenda. So there's too much an emphasis on agential power of charismatic, heroic entrepreneurs, but they have very much underestimated the significance of context. In the conclusion sections, we often see the word, like context matters, but how that matters, the nuanced, illustrations are lacking. So in most cases, context is, basically reduced to a residual category without much, deeper analysis. So as I commented yesterday after the keynote speeches, I said basically policy entrepreneur originated, if you look at the John Kingdon's classic book, originated from multiple streams model, but can PE as a explanatory concept going the other way around and make some sort of theoretical contribution to policy process model. And Michael Howlett and his colleagues in Singapore have done a fascinating job. So they basically further teased out the role of policy entrepreneurs into other processes. You can see that they somehow came up with a 6-stream variant of the multiple streams model. They called it 6 streams model. And then if you look at it, so many of the policy on the street level policy entrepreneurs in developing countries, they call them as program champions, right? So if you look at the developing world, much of the developments, the reforms actually happen in a very small scale. But bit by bit, they actually change the situation from a bottom up. So and then when we review, we received lots of submissions, but many of them got rejected because many of these manuscripts submitted to us use PE as a loose metaphor, it's too much concept stretching, without much closer engagement, very rigorous engagement to the mainstream literature or any theoretical frameworks. So as Wick pointed out, this concept has been overused, and then essentially policy entrepreneurship has become a concept that pulls too many wagons. In the end, it becomes meaningless, right? So, and then you look at lots of similar concepts are being used, and then there's actually another sizable body of literature they call them IE, institutional entrepreneurship, but it strikes me that these two bodies of literature hardly converge. And then if you look at how they actually describe the so-called institutional entrepreneurs, for example, the forms of power and their attributes, sense makers, sense givers, they are remarkably similar to what we already know, right? In the public sector reforms, the PEs as described by Michael and Norman in their 2009 paper, right? That's a very popular source of citation. And then another thing is, this is the paper I mentioned yesterday. To be called a good theory, you got to have some sort of predictory power, right? Otherwise, you remain at the stage of describing a success retrospectively. So how to really enhance the capacity of prediction. This is the paper I mentioned yesterday. This is done by a group of scholars based in Canada and the US. They have basically conducted a quite large-scale survey of the Chinese senior bureaucrats, who were trained in the CPC Central Party School. So basically, they engaged the literature of psychological studies and then somehow measured the personality of Chinese senior bureaucrats. So basically categorized them into authoritarian style, consultative style, and the entrepreneurial style. Basically, they argue that those who demonstrated high entrepreneurial attributes are more likely to undertake brave innovations in the future. Of course, this study suffers from lots of methodological weaknesses, but at the end of the day, this is still, nevertheless, still very good attempt. This should be the sort of study we are encouraging, and as a sort of guest added. This is the last slide, and you look at the methods. So this body of literature is often criticized for being weak in external validity, in generalizability, case study driven, and you cannot really replicate the findings. So qualitative studies do have their power and their value, but at the same time, the small sample size is always the intrinsic sort of drawback. However, when we actually move to quantitative study, these are the sort of very difficult barriers we have to overcome. For example, how to operationalize, how to identify PE, who is PE, who is not, and how to really measure their traits, their entrepreneurial activities, strategies, sample size. These are all the very, very difficult methodological barriers we have to overcome. So the possible direction for us is, I think probably we could slightly go beyond single case study to embrace comparative case study. Several cases, and then you can somehow increase the external validity. And another quite promising tool which is available in social sciences is QCA, right? And then you use qualitative comparative analysis to really draw out some more analytically rigorous findings. And the last one is mixed methods. We already listened to some very good insights in the last session. So mixed methods is a very powerful tool to enhance both the internal validity and external validity. And in particular, because most of the PE research is very much qualitatively oriented. And if we actually use the explanatory sequential strategy, which is a very popular strategy, you start from core, and then using core, the wisdom, the insights drawn from qualitative studies to frame them into some sort of testable hypothesis and test them in the wider context. This is a very popular way. And yesterday, actually, Nikos gave us a very good illustration. It's the 3 expectations. The higher, the better, the lower, the better, that kind of things. So this is a very effective way of, I think, going forward. All right? Thank you very much.
No. Oh, is it okay? I'm here?
Anand, no one will see you. Is that okay?
Only heard, not seen.
Yeah. So, like God. People ask for jokes about God, right? So thank you for this. I had the presentation, okay? There's no paper yet, so I'm referring to the presentation, what you sent me, and what you presented today. And basically, I have 3 comments, or more like 3 thoughts. I'll go from the specific to the more general. So the specific thing is, I think that saying just the selection criteria were different with the 2 surveys. I think it might give us many more insights if you'll have more details there. Why did they find 47 papers? Why did they find 27 papers? Like, give more insights from comparing the reviews. I think comparing the reviews can give you good insights. Okay, and then we know that quantitative research is very rare. So I think it will be very nice if somebody will look at the rare, like me, with outliers. So look at the outliers, look at the quantitative, and say something about how quantitative PE research is done, and maybe we'll get some insights how to do more quantitative research in PE. So that was very, like very specific comments. Another question or thought was that maybe I missed it, but I didn't see any comparison between what we know or what we accumulated about PE in the Western world as opposed to the developing world. So we have these two reviews, and you have your knowledge about what happens in terms of PE in the developing world, and we have huge body of literature of what's PE in the Western world. But I think the first step is to compare them. Okay, what's the difference? Is it? I can understand why you say it's a nice soil for examining it, but what's the difference? How doing it in the developing world differ from doing it in Western world? Is it more difficult? Is it easier? Is it different strategies? What's the difference between them? And then my big question, I go to Shlomo. Yesterday Shlomo talked about big questions, so I think my big question will be, we always, and I think you are also a captive already, we always ask how Western developed theories apply for developing countries. And I want to ask the opposite question. What can the Western democracies learn from what we know about developing countries? I think we need to look at it the other way around too, and not take it for granted that if Western democracies say this is the theory, because this is what's happening here, so now we ask ourselves does it happen in developing countries? I would go the other way around as well. Either as about policy entrepreneurship, or as I told you, like in a bigger picture, asking bigger how theories or concepts or analytical frameworks that are more suitable to developing countries reflect about our knowledge in the Western world. Just.
Thank you both. And it goes straight to Dr. Batinsky with regulatory policy entrepreneurship and case of competition and financial regulation, and then followed by by Dan.
לא מגיע. Computer is stuck.
Yeah, no. Yeah, I'll show you. Show you. I don't want to record. Well, I would actually, but I'll show you. Yeah. Just, okay. Oh, no, not just. Very good, very good.
We're so polite.
That was, I think I'll disagree, but it's about the hypothesis, because in some qualitative traditions you come without hypothesis, like these more grounded theories, and so that was the idea here. And the other is that I would say that this political market framework is one that at some point tries to compete to explain the adoption of the policy process with these others. But that has this missing part, I believe. So the point with this is, or what the political market, what I think that will emphasize is that in the end, politicians are willing to sell their preferred policies to those who pay better for them. So that's, it's more grounded in this idea that in some rules will amplify who can pay more. Basically, that's yeah, but I will definitely will explore other ways of framing it.
Sean?
The political market just came because that was.
Just a sec, because I want to give Alex the opportunity to answer too.
Okay, sure.
Oh, you want to actually, you want to?
Yeah, just to say something to Edgar about
Okay.
it.
Because we will be collecting questions as well. afterwards.
Okay, so,
We're just
but
been
just
at this post now.
two quick thoughts. I think your data can give two other lines of research. One of them is that I think we rarely compare different street level bureaucrats within the same policy context. And I think this is a good and nice opportunity to look at how different sectors of street level bureaucrats, how different professions are treated, appreciated. Are there like more prestigious, less prestigious? Do they listen more to these profession? So I think we rarely have cases or data that in the same policy there are different professions that are involved. So I think it's a very nice opportunity to look at it from this perspective. And now my other comment, and you know me, so take it with a grain of salt. We keep saying we don't have enough failures to check. Like we don't have failure cases. Maybe this is...
Well, you just get one failure and one success.
Yeah, but you know, so maybe that's... Yeah. Not failure in terms of passing, but failure in terms of
stopping it.
Yeah, failure to stop, exactly. Like Shlomo said yesterday, the failure to resist.
Right. Also, the one that was stopped could be also seen as a failure because that was the pet project of one of the mayor's lieutenants, the one that was stopped. So.
Yeah. Okay, but shall we go now with Gar's paper and then
it's not only
we'll
mine,
go back to
it's mine and Nissim's. My co-author is sitting here. Hi guys, first of all I want to apologize for not being more in this conference. I would have loved to, but I have a baby at home, so she takes priority. But I'm very happy to come and present this paper. And I also have some good news. This paper was recently accepted to the Journal of Public Policy. So we would, even though it's already published, we would really like you to give us some comments and maybe think about collaborations, because I think the comparative aspect of this paper is highly important. These are test cases from Israel, and we would love to collaborate with people from other jurisdictions to see how this thing works in other places around the world as well. Okay, so our paper is about regulatory policy entrepreneurs, and regulatory reforms are an important part of the decision-making process. So what do I mean when I say regulatory reform? We're talking about cases where the regulators don't have the power from the law to regulate as they want, and they need to approach Parliament in order to change the law or make a reform so that it gives them more power. Politicians and bureaucratic regulators are in charge of regulating markets and serve as agents of changing policy, as we all know. And the interesting thing is that what we were interested in is finding out if the presence of a regulatory entrepreneur changes the picture. Now, of course, regulators, they are in charge of changing policy, you know. So what do I mean when I say a regulatory entrepreneur? Well, most regulators, they don't want to rock the boat, okay? Most of them are quite happy with just, you know, doing their role and then moving on with a revolving door to sit in a CEO position in the industry, and they don't want to rock the boat too much. But some regulators are entrepreneurs, and they actually do care about policy, and we were interested in how their presence changes the regulatory reforms that we are checking. Okay? So the interactions between politicians and bureaucrats, it has been analyzed and discussed politician-bureaucrats interactions have been broadly discussed in literature. However, the focus on the interaction between regulators and politicians is surprisingly scarce. So, people have talked about the captured regulator and about all kinds of other aspects of the regulatory work, but the interactions between these two groups of actors is scarce. And we want to develop a conceptual framework for understanding these interactions. Okay, so we use policy entrepreneurship in order to analyze the case studies that we found in Israel. In the regulatory context, if the regulator entrepreneur is also an expert, okay, so if he comes with some sort of expertise, for example, he's a professor or has vast knowledge on the policy case, he's much more likely to succeed. The expertise allows the regulatory entrepreneur to identify the problem and also to devise a solution to this problem. Combining the regulatory expertise with political acumen and identifying a window of opportunity usually leads to success. And I will show you two cases. In one case is a case of a reform that the whole market thought was a good reform, so obviously such a good reform, is very likely to succeed. But the other reform was highly criticized by everyone in the market, including the politicians, and it still managed to go through because the regulator used the tactics that I'm going to show you here. Okay, so what is the relationship between regulatory entrepreneurs and politicians? Well, regulators have a broader horizon than the politicians. They view the market, they are specialists in the market that they regulate. Politicians have to deal with many things and care mainly about being re-elected. It can sometimes be viewed as a double-sided monopoly. And the regulation is affected by external forces, such as interest groups and so on, public opinion. Among the regulators, there are a few regulatory entrepreneurs who distinctively have both the motivation and the ability to push forward the reforms that they desire. So what was our methodology? First, we used textual sources. So basically, with the two reforms that are our case studies, we read the protocols of the Knesset, and we actually saw what was going on in the debate around the table, and also newspaper pieces about it and so on. We had tens of non-participant observations in the Knesset during 2008. And one observation also at a major conference in which the CEO of one of the affected firms was sitting and complaining about this reform. And we had over 20 interviews, which were mostly done by snowball sampling, with everyone that was sitting around the table. So the lobbyists, the politicians, people from the media that covered the cases and so on and so forth, affected firms, of course. So what are our two cases? So the two cases are cases from Israel. One is a case in the banking sector where the supervisor of banks had an idea how to increase competition in the bank fees for household consumers in 2008. And the second was a reform in competition law, which followed the large protest which we had in Israel, where people went out to the streets and complained that things were too expensive here, so that a change was made and the new law was enacted outside the competition law. And in both cases, there were windows of opportunities for jumping on the wagon. Yeah, so. The differences between the cases. The first was, as I already told you, how the cases were viewed by experts in the field. So the bank fee reform was viewed as a positive thing, increasing competition in the banking sector, and everybody really liked this reform, and it's still viewed as one of the successful reforms. It really helped, and the competition increased in the sector that the reform touched. The other reform, the competition law reform, was viewed as a bad idea. People said, experts in the field said, this has never been tried anywhere in the world. Why do you want to invent the wheel, and so on and so forth. There are different fields of regulation, right? The banking and competition. And the nature of interactions between the entrepreneurs and the politicians was different. The popularity of the reforms was different. And also the strengths and characteristics of the window of opportunity, because the window of opportunity for the banking reform was that one of the banks raised one of the fees at the same week that the CEO took home 3 million shekels bonus. And then this erupted in the news as it was the first time actually that the newspapers in Israel talked about banks and how it's not appropriate for the managers to take home such large sums when the fees are so expensive. Oh, sorry. But for the competition law reform, the window of opportunity was the social protest, and this was a much stronger window of opportunity. Basically, the Knesset came to the regulator and said, give us whatever solution you have, we need to do something and make it cheaper for people here in Israel. Okay, so it was a much stronger window of opportunity. Okay, the barriers. So the main barrier is that you are dependent on politicians. You want to pass your reform, but there are politicians there who need to pass it for you, and they're not always willing. The second thing is that there are interest groups. Of course, the regulated firms have a lot to lose if these reforms go through. And the public doesn't understand your reforms in these areas because those are very complicated areas, right? Both banking and competition. It's really hard to explain to the public why your reform is important and what it's going to do. And there are also other barriers relating to the interaction between your regulatory authority and the other regulatory authorities that are active in the field. And there are also some structural barriers. So, for example, in the competition law case, one of the structural barriers was that the competition authority didn't have a research department in the competition authority. So prior to passing this reform, the head of competition, the new head of competition authority that had the idea for this reform, he formed a research center inside the authority in order to do research, in order to be able to bring a ready-made solution to the table. Okay, so the strategies. First of all, so here's how you do it, right? You have to identify a window of opportunity, and once a window of opportunity opens, you can jump on the window of opportunity and try to change the direction in which the politicians want to act, right? So the politicians, for example, in the banking fee reform, they had an idea, let's put the fees under supervision and we will tell the market how much fees they should charge from people. And the bank supervisor said, wait, this is a bad idea, I have a better idea. Let's do something else and increase competition in the market so that the competitive market will give us the price. You use your expertise to persuade, so you need to come with a research that is already made inside your department, and you have to be a knowledgeable regulator that the politicians trust. Another strategy is to set up one-on-one meetings with each politician, right? So they actually go around and they meet with all the relevant politicians and they do their own lobbying in order to persuade politicians that their idea is the good one. You use the press, and this is something that I found really interesting to find out. Before you pass your reform, you identify which outlets of media will work with you, and then you bring them already newspaper pieces or things like that, and you give interviews. You especially use the press when you think that the lobbyists are doing a good job. Because when you think the lobbyists are doing a good job and they will cancel your reform, you go to the press and then you explain to the people how your reform is a good idea, and then the politicians feel that now they are being watched, so they cannot cave in to the lobbyists. And you bring a ready-made solution to the table. So basically what a few of the people we interviewed said was that it's a well-known fact for everybody that's in the game that they have kind of a ready-made solutions which are not yet reforms, and every time a new minister arrives, they try to give the ready-made solutions and see which one will pass. Okay, so what can we learn from comparing the two cases that we chose? First of all, we can learn about the regulatory expertise, the ability to push forward reforms. Second, the political ability is extremely important in understanding who wants what and why, and then being able to give whatever each politician wants, right? A ready-made solution increases the chances of success, using a fertile ground in order to change the reform. So sometimes the politicians already have an idea for the reform, but you can come up with a better idea and change the way in which the reform is going and make them adopt your reform and not their original idea. Simplifying the issue. This is a very important thing. You need to explain the problem and provide an easy to understand solution, not only to the politicians, but also to the public. So, so that you can explain something easily to the public. And understanding the importance of the media, which is very important. So, conclusions. First, in today's world, regulatory entrepreneurship becomes more and more prevalent. In Israel, for sure. I'm guessing around the world as well. And again, we would love to know about it and learn about it. Understanding regulatory entrepreneurship is crucial for predicting which regulatory reforms will actually pass and which will fail. And that's it. So,
over to your colleagues. Okay. So thank you very much. I read this paper again last night because I wasn't supposed to be the discussant. So
thank you for that.
Thanks for that.
So I have my perspective of reading it, which I've seen you present before, so that's why I could easily slip in. But it is also given the perspective of the things we discussed yesterday. And so I have a little bit of an advantage. And given that I know the context of where you were, one of the things that very much was strong to me when I was reading this again last night was how much we asked yesterday what the questions were in policy entrepreneurship, and one of them was, should we be asking who this person is? And given the window of opportunities that was here in Israel, and knowing that there were other people who tried to jump on the wagon and didn't, one of the very strong questions is this a question of who the person is? Why did these people succeed where others fail? The second thing to do with the normative question that we were talking about yesterday, from reading this case again, we talked about whether it was good or not. But when we talked about the dependent variables that we should be asking is whether there was a change. Now, it seems that from your perspective, if it's a good or not, maybe is a question of the satisfaction of the people, of the public. So maybe it's not so much how big the delta is in the change, but more the impact later on. And maybe what policy entrepreneurship should also be examining as a dependent variable is that impact further on. The other thing that strikes me very strongly is the extent to which the policy entrepreneur is actually acting like a politician. So if we go back to the who question, the more I have the political skills and the more I act like a politician, maybe that's what makes me a better entrepreneur. And that's something that is very clear when you actually read the cases that you gave as examples. And when I was reading these two cases, and in the actual article, which has been published, so I'm not going to give you ideas of how to make it better, but it brought, when I was doing my, so the cases are very much explained. You get to know these people who did these policy changes. And when I was doing my postdoc in Cornell with Professor Sam Backrack, who's a negotiations person, he was writing 2 books on leadership. And we talked about leadership yesterday, and one of them was called Get Them on Your Side. And the second one was called Keep Them on Your Side. And the keep them on your side part is less relevant because for leadership you need to keep people there. Here you just need to make the change. But I'm going to read to you the 10 questions that this book, Get Them on Your Side, and it just puts in different words a lot of the things that we were talking about here, but there is one issue that I'm going to come to, and I promise it will only be 2 minutes. So the first question is, what is my agenda? The second is, how do I map my own agenda objectively? What may seem like a huge leap for me may seem very traditional for someone else. What are the agendas of the people I want on my side? How do I know which agenda each person has, especially those who are not so close to me but are important to get them on my side? How do I bring together a coalition at each stage of the change, preparing for change, initiating change, putting in place, and stabilizing change? Okay, so here it's change and agenda. How do I translate my beautiful dream into operating form without losing the people who love the dream? How do I establish credibility? That's what I'm going to come back soon. Even if I have credibility, how is it going to help me with resistors who do not agree with my goals? In getting initial support, how do I co-opt leaders who have different agendas to mine? And how do I incorporate different groups? What do I say to each of the groups? So these were the 10 issues that this book answered, which I think is different wording to a lot of the things we said here. And the issue that we didn't discuss enough, I think, maybe is the issue of credibility. So if I think about the 2 papers we saw before, you talked about credibility as experience, and you talked about credibility as reputation. And maybe one of the questions that public entrepreneurship has to ask is, how do I gain credibility in order to make the change in policy? And we have 2 examples, maybe there are many.
Thank you both. So last webinar note on the strategies of local government policy and finance, and then followed by Shlomo.
This is a project I've been kicking around for a while, and I haven't done a lot with it. Mostly because I got, well, a couple of reasons. Mostly because I got mad at it. I couldn't get to all of the answers that I wanted to be able to at the beginning, but I'm really excited to have this opportunity to present it. And I think maybe that there might be some good here, so you can tell me which are the better or worse parts. But the idea here was to understand how policy entrepreneurs secure their aims, and the real motivation was this problem we can find in the literature that a lot of people have talked about, where we have all these theories about policy entrepreneurs, but we haven't tested them across a large number of cases. And there was a paper that you wrote, Michael, where there was this one quote saying something like, well, it would be great to test this across a large number of cases, but getting cases that are sufficiently isomorphic is really, really difficult. And here, I thought I had a situation, I actually still think I had a situation where the cases were fairly isomorphic. So I was like, oh, okay, this is a chance to do a larger end evaluation of propositions that we have about policy entrepreneurs. So that was the idea here. These are some of the folks that I work with, and I always want to acknowledge them because I work with a lot of students. I'm in charge of our undergrad programs, so they always end up being my interns, and they gather a lot of data. They do a great job. God is also a crucial part of our work, so I wanted to thank them some things. Okay. So my work concerns high-volume hydraulic fracturing, or fracking as a form of oil and gas drilling. It has become a major phenomenon in the U.S. energy landscape and worldwide. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it here, except to say that, well, these are pictures of shale plays in the United States. Most of my research focuses on this one up here, the Marcellus Shale, which is the world's largest unconventional natural gas reserve, or second largest. It's been a huge thing. Most of the natural gas that the United States produces comes from fracking. More than half of its oil does at this point. So, major development. And it has reinvigorated local economies in many of these areas. And a lot of the places where fracking is occurring have been economically marginalized for quite some time, like parts of Appalachia. Something also important to know about the context in the United States is that fracking is primarily regulated at the state level rather than at the federal level. And this has been a major source of controversy, but it is what it is. And an interesting phenomenon that I look at, even beyond the state regulation, is local regulation. So there have been, in a number of states, efforts from the bottom up So folks saying, hey, we don't want fracking here, and trying to pass local ordinances prohibiting fracking. And in some states it's been shot down by state court. So Colorado, Texas, they've said, no, you can't do that. So Texas actually passed a ban on localities passing bans on fracking, which one might expect. But in other places, localities have been able to do this, and the state of New York is one of them. New York was interesting to me because I lived on and off in Philly during when I was in grad school, so in the mid to late 2000s, and that was when fracking really began to boom in the state of Pennsylvania. New York borders Pennsylvania, it's right north of it, but fracking didn't happen in New York. And it overlays the same shale play. It had the same opportunities. And so as I drove back and forth from Indiana to Philly and saw all these drilling rigs and all these flares and everything, so I was like, what's happening here, and why is it not happening in New York? What's going on in New York? And it turns out that New York is one of those places where there was a lot of two factors, right? In 2008, state regulators in New York said, hey, we don't know what's going on with fracking, right? And big things are happening in Pennsylvania. We're not sure what we want to do about this, so let's place a moratorium on fracking for a while, till we figure it out. Less than a year, it'll be done. No, less than 6 years. But, right, in 2008, they were like, okay, we're gonna put a state-level moratorium on fracking. And localities, right, said, we don't know how long the state's going to take. We don't know what the state's going to do. So maybe it would be in our interest to pass some local restrictions on fracking, just so that we're prepared. So if the state authorizes fracking tomorrow, we still have protections, and then we can sort of study it at our leisure, and we can adopt ordinances as we like. So we had this wave of local policymaking concerning fracking in New York. And I said, this is the case. It's the same problem. All these localities are facing the same challenge. And all of them are under the same state moratorium. And all of them are acting in a fairly short amount of time. So is this set of isomorphic cases where we can look at policy entrepreneurship? And there was literature, articles coming out of New York which suggested that this could be the case. There were stories of actors who went around from municipality to municipality carrying copies of policies, trying to get them to pass them. Helen and David Schlotsky, they're from upstate New York, and they are a husband and wife lawyer team, and they went to like more than 80 municipalities with their model zoning ordinance. Yeah, so I was like, okay, I can study policy entrepreneurs because I know that they exist. Like the New York Times has told me that they exist. Yeah, Helen Schlotsky. Okay, so primarily this is not about theory development. It's trying to be about theory testing. And I have 3 research questions. They probably don't belong in the same paper. It's not a paper, it's just a presentation at this point. But I wanted to know, okay, what factors facilitate policy entrepreneur emergence? Does policy entrepreneurship encourage policy adoption? And if so, what factors facilitate policy entrepreneur success? And so when I thought about emergence, I thought about classic work by Schneider and Teskey, Slack resources. So there's something there. A policy entrepreneur can go and thinks that they have a fertile opportunity in a specific place. They're going to be able to gain power. They're going to be able to pass the policy there and set an example. There's some reason, some resources there that they want, and that's why they target that place. There are low barriers to entry. The community seems receptive to their activity. And they're probably going to be more successful in a place, right, that cares more about their issue. So these are all factors that we might see facilitating emergence. We talked about this one a lot. I think we all think, generally speaking, that policy entrepreneurs are going to encourage policy adoption. So I was just going to test this over a large number of cases. And then factors facilitating policy entrepreneur success. This is the part that ended up frustrating me about this paper. This is like, I got mad at it. But many of them I would think would be the same as emergence. So low barriers. If it's easier to do your job, maybe you'll do your job better. If the community is more on your side, just talk about maybe you'll be able to do your job more effectively. If the issue is more important to people in that place, maybe it will be easier for you to sell your policy. Maybe there's something about you, right? Maybe it's your job, maybe it's your social acuity, maybe it's your connections. Maybe it's the disruptiveness of the advocacy strategies you use. Maybe writing a letter to the editor is not going to cut it, but maybe holding a protest is. Maybe there's something about the desire or the policies that you're going after. Right? And I argue that there's something about the disruptiveness of these policies. By time, I'll explain in the regression how I actually coded this incorrectly, but got an interesting result. Oh goodness, okay, I won't talk about that in the regression. And then community level ambiguity. So I had a hard time operationalizing this. I went at it a lot of different ways. There's an ambiguity, or rather, there's an endogeneity issue, even trying to include community level ambiguity in regressions, wherein you have a policy entrepreneur, because you don't know if the policy entrepreneur is drawn to the ambiguity or is causing the ambiguity, but I put it in anyway just to try. Okay, we know who these guys are. I'm not going to talk about this. Policy entrepreneurs, yes. Okay. Also not going to talk about this. It's mostly what I just said. Okay, sample was New York municipalities whose clerks responded to a survey that I sent them about policy entrepreneurship. So there's about 1,500 municipalities in New York. I got responses from like 440 folks. Independent variables were gathered from a lot of secondary sources and in some cases from the survey. So I'm talking about socioeconomic, demographic, political, contextual variables, and then PE characteristics and activities. And in terms of dependent variables, I'm talking about whether there is an anti-fracking policy entrepreneur, so emergence. Whether an anti-fracking policy was adopted, so efficacy of the policy entrepreneur, at least I'm inferring if they were in a place, right, and the place adopted the kind of policy they wanted, that maybe they had some connection there. And success, measured by policy adoption, but also is evaluated by the respondents to the survey. So I actually was able to get a success measure for policy entrepreneurs who saw their policies adopted and for those who didn't see their policies adopted. So we're able to get to some of those negative cases. And I used some regressions. Okay, so this is a challenge that Alex was talking about. How do you identify policy entrepreneurs? Not sure that I've done it well, but policy entrepreneurs were identified by asking respondents whether, since 2008 the start of the moratorium, anyone had pursued one of 10 activities that were drawn from the policy entrepreneurship literature, like contacting your officials to try to get them to pass a policy, or showing up at a public meeting and trying to advocate for a policy. Policy entrepreneurs were reported in 108 jurisdictions and 90 were operative over the period that I look at. So this is 19% of municipalities that responded to the survey. And of those 19%, 61% passed one or more anti-fracking policies. And again, I've already touched on how I define entrepreneur success by what actually happened, whether the policy is adopted or not, and by the clerk who is responding to the survey. And this is just sort of a side note. These are the activities that were associated with these I should actually, one more note. I gave folks like 10 options, right? And I said, okay, think if somebody in your jurisdiction did at least one of these, you might have a policy entrepreneur. And then I said, think about the person who was most active in doing these things. So I think probably that it's not going to be someone who did just one of these things. Like, I asked them to think of the person who's most active. So on average, these policy entrepreneurs pursue like 3 of these different kinds of strategies. I don't have occupation data for most of them. Those that I do have it for, they were public officials, most are from the community, and most are not politically active on other issues. Okay, I spent a lot of time getting a bunch of policies. They were not collected, policies that municipalities adopted against fracking, they were not collected in any kind of centralized way. This is where the interns come in. Took a while. Okay, map of policies across the state. So these are the different kinds of policies that were adopted. There's nothing really here that you need to take away, except the bans are the most disruptive, I argue, because they permanently prohibit fracking. The rest place temporary restrictions on it or restrict it, but do not prevent it. And some don't do anything at all. And these are just the policies as adopted over the period I studied. Actually, the policies. Okay, 31% response rate, survey, etc. So, okay, regressions predicting efficacy and emergence. So this one here is policy entrepreneur emergence, and what we see here is, interestingly, when there is an individual that a clerk indicated in the town was actually in favor of fracking and advocated against the policy entrepreneur, the anti-fracking policy entrepreneur, we were more likely to see an anti-fracking policy entrepreneur emerge. That's clear. But basically, there was more opposition in this place, and we were more likely to see an anti-fracking policy entrepreneur. We were more likely to see these entrepreneurs emerge in more rural areas overlaid in shale. So that's the population density. It's a measure of rurality. That makes sense that the fracking is going to occur if it happens. You're more likely to see them emerge in places that have one or more tourism-related policy that they passed in the previous 5 years, indicating that they're interested in quality of life sorts of issues. And so maybe having well derricks and flaring is not going to be like in their best interest. And then if neighbors adopted anti-fracking policies, you were more likely to see an anti-fracking policy emerge. And I have the interns constructing a neighbor policy entrepreneur success variable. So turning to efficacy, so the one that we already all thought would happen, yes, it turns out that if you're looking at jurisdictions and whether or not they adopt an anti-fracking policy, one significant driver of that is whether there is an anti-fracking policy entrepreneur in that jurisdiction. This is looking across the 400 or so survey responses. Again, we have whether you're overlaying a shale, whether you're in a more rural area, being important. So these are the places where the policy entrepreneurs are more successful. And then again, you have this neighbor variable being important. So when you can look and see policies being adopted by neighbors, you are more likely yourself to adopt one of these policies. Neighbor effects, we would expect this. That says in words some percentages. We'll move past those. Those say in graphs those percentages. Okay. And yeah, more graphs. Okay. So what influences policy entrepreneur success? This is where I got stuck. Because of missing this in some of the data, I ended up sort of working with between 70 and 90 cases where I had a policy entrepreneur and I was using the rating of its success, of that policy entrepreneur success provided by the clerk. And I had a whole range of variables I wanted to test. I'd asked the clerks about tons of stuff about these actors, and I didn't know what to do. So I ended up running a whole bunch of bivariate regressions to try to see what of these many, many factors that I had asked about seemed to be associated with success. And then I ended up putting these in red into, well, first in within cluster regressions, and then in a larger regression. So in bivariate analysis, what ended up being significant is whether there was opposition. This actually negatively, it impacted success. Whether a policy entrepreneur was more knowledgeable about government, that individual seemed more likely to be successful. The government official's political ideology, Democratic. Whether the extent of the disruptiveness of the advocacy, more disruptive, so organizing a protest, being more successful than writing a letter to the editor. Disruptiveness of the policy that the person sought, so I'll go into the Q&A, what I thought this was going to be, but essentially, if they wanted a ban, either more disruptive kinds of measures or measures like a ban, they ended up being more successful. And this is a bunch of attempts to look at ambiguity, but basically, if there were local mixed feelings on fracking, if the clerk said, yes, during this period of time that you're studying, a lot of people had negative and a lot of people had positive opinions on fracking, this seemed to be associated with success. Whether it's a cause or a result, unclear. But putting these in a regression together, yes, okay. Putting these in a regression together, what it seems to be is that when a policy entrepreneur is more knowledgeable about local government, he or she is more successful. When this individual uses a more disruptive set of advocacy tactics, and when this individual seeks a more disruptive sort of policy, we see them being more successful. That is all.
Oh, they don't come forward?
It's fine. Okay. Okay.
Shai's ready.
Now you said it. Now he's coming. You're shamed.
Okay. I think that I will use this paper for presenting some of the points regarding policies and entrepreneurship, but also some general thoughts or ideas that came to me based on this paper and others as well. So this is, I would say, a very ambitious paper, which attempts to apply quantitative analysis and measures to the area of entrepreneurship. And as said before, this is very rare in this field. There are several interesting conclusions and findings. However, and here I start with the problems. However, I think that the paper shows very good the problems of applying quantitative methods to this area. So basically, I think that the main problem is that it is very difficult to catch the operating mechanism of entrepreneurship by quantitative methods. You can show what happened on the surface, but it is very difficult to get deep into the mechanism. And I think that this is one of the reasons that most of the studies in this area go for qualitative and trying to look in deep inside the process. So I think that this is also what is happening here. It is very difficult, and as you said, you had to run many regressions and to find what is going on there, and therefore this is a main problem. Later I will try to show my thinking about how we may go forward with this aspect as well, but before that, a few things about specific points in the paper. So I would say that the main methodological problem is the self-report. People self-report, and there is a common source bias. And there is a problem here where involved people report on the data themselves. So you said that there are problems of operationalization, and in the paper as well, and you try to explain how to avoid them, but for my impression, it is not entirely convincing. The explanation of how to override the problems in the measurement. So from a point of a reviewer, I would say that this will be a main issue in the operationalization of the variables. Again, you say that you do not develop theory, but you try to test theories. Again, this may be very problematic because at the end of it, most of your hypotheses are rather intuitive. And people look for, okay, so what is new here, or what is the so you said that the added value is the quantitative methods, but again, this added value has its own problems. So the overall contribution is not entirely clear. Either you contribute to the theory or you contribute to the method, but if both of them are relatively weak, then there is a problem in convincing that the paper adds value. Another point is that it is hard to distinguish between social activists and policy entrepreneurs. I had the impression when I read the paper that actually these are social activists, and only towards the middle of the paper you get to the distinction and say what is the distinction between them. And I think that this raises a general problem with this area where, and maybe here a general thought for this panel, because as I see it, it is very difficult to identify what we are talking about. So it seems that policy entrepreneurs may be social activists. For example, mobilizing collective action is a strategy of policy entrepreneurs. If yes, then these are social activists. So the distinction is not clear. Maybe we talk about interest groups or policy experts, as some presenters said earlier. So it seems that the definition of the concept is not entirely clear, and we move from different aspects and concepts, and therefore I would ask, again, the panel as a whole, I would ask whether maybe we simply make things more complex rather than simplify. And from my opinion, a good theory is a simple one. So I think that the great challenge is to try to identify what is the uniqueness in the concept of policy entrepreneurship, and in what ways it is different from social activists, from experts, from all others possible identifications. And just the last point, because I don't know if I have more time, but last point, I think that this applies also to street level bureaucrats. Because when we hear about street level bureaucrats, actually we don't hear about street level bureaucrats, we hear about the role they play. For example, soldiers and the physician and social worker and so on and so. So why? What is the unique? What makes them? And what is the motivation? The unique motivation and operating mechanism of street level bureaucrats that justify to see them as such. Because otherwise we can talk about teachers and doctors and so on and so on, but what makes them a unique category to analyze in public administration? Again, these are general points that I think that the whole panel can try to emphasize and one last idea, I think that maybe in order to try to go to quantitative analysis, maybe we should try to think in terms of equilibrium analysis. Like there are forces which compete with each other, and for this kind of operationalization, we have methods to measure. So I think that maybe if we go in a different direction, trying to think in terms of forces and that compete with each other and produce a certain equilibrium, in that case, I think that we have some more efficient ways of measuring these aspects. So
thank you. Our time has been slightly extended by DC, so we have until 12:50. We did. So shall we open to the floor? I suggest that we each take about 3 questions, and then the presenters can also answer their discussant at the same time. And that's okay. So yeah, I think Sita. Oh, no, Sita? No. No, I guess no. Go.
Okay. Firstly, thank you for your interesting presentation. My question is a bit related to what Shlomo brought up, and I would like to ask whether it's, maybe I'll zoom in a bit, whether it's possible for you to elaborate about the theoretical definition of success, of entrepreneurship success, and its operationality.
I'll stay with the last paper too. I guess one of the questions that I have is I was looking at the independent variables. Did you test for multicollinearity? Because I am sure there is multicollinearity between the disruptiveness of the issue and the emergence of the anti-fracking coalition. Because if you're advocating something that will not ban, then maybe there will not be any opposition there. So one affects the other. It could be possible that you could sort of use one of them as an intermediate variable. And did you do any, what I would have done would be any interactive terms, because that to me would probably give you some very interesting results. That is, multiplying probably some of the attributes with the strategies that you were talking about.
Maybe first of all, from the floor.
Yeah.
Good.
question is to Alex, and I'm continuing Nat's thoughts about the comparison between Asia and other Western countries. And she talked about the comparison between developing countries and Western countries. And I thought about a comparison between, or maybe difference between more collectivist cultures and individualistic ones. Because if we're speaking about policy entrepreneurs in terms of individuals who seek to change policy, and I don't really know much about collectivist cultures, but I think maybe people used to operate more in kind of teams or groups. So I wonder if there is a difference between maybe the strategies, the entrepreneurial strategies of policy entrepreneurs, and specifically in the street level, because they have less power, but they need others to help them promote their agenda. So maybe this would be, maybe you have an answer as to the difference or similarities. Maybe it's also a good place to think about research, future research.
So maybe starting this way. Yeah, starting from Alex this way, Edgar, and also I thought maybe people would like to answer the more general question of Shlomo, which I thought was quite general.
So it's me?
No, I thought. Yeah.
Your questions, right? We have to.
Yeah. So, just a general comment following one article which I really love your attempt to do what the research that I think that we should follow the direction, because each research method has its advantages and disadvantages. But I think the question is really, how can we? I think that people will better define, not you specifically, all of us, we will better define what policy entrepreneurs and what street-level bureaucrats are. Our life would be a bit easier. I think that in the case of street-level bureaucracy, we do know what street-level bureaucrats are. They are frontline workers, they have a lot of discretion, they interact daily with workers, so there's a clear separation between street-level bureaucrats to regular bureaucrats or other bureaucrats. But I think that when it's come to policy entrepreneurs, we are facing a bit more challenge. So I'm just throwing it to the air if anyone can suggest accurate definition of policy entrepreneurship.
Shall we do some
Yes,
responses, then we'll collect some more?
Yeah, so thank you, Annette, for the comments, and Annette for the questions also. Probably I'll give a response together. So first of all, because the purpose, probably my presentation is slightly different from others, which most of them are empirical studies. Mine is basically like the general review of these two special issues, the findings and the arguments we have collected. So the purpose is really to write a very good, solid sort of introductory piece, and that can become a sort of motivation and inspiration for the studies. So first of all, I like the idea Annette has suggested. So basically, in the end, after we have collected all these papers and published them online, we'll write a very sort of a review, especially for the two literature survey papers, and one of them had a sample of close to 50, the other was smaller, and then we'll basically look into the details of their sampling methods and then come up with some sort of like meta-analysis and look at whether the analysis was rigorous enough. And then about another point mentioned by Annette, I truly appreciate your comments that it probably the policy learning, the direction of the policy learning should be some sort of two-way traffic, right? So instead of having this sort of colonial mentality or the sense of developing country inferiority, probably it's a time to start the other way, the traffic from the other way around, and then try to come up with some sort of useful lessons and experiences probably the developing countries can offer to the developed countries, right? So, and I think Michael and I will think about it very thoroughly, and then this is very good comments. And then for the question Eden has raised, this is basically there's a very clear distinction between collective or corporate entrepreneurship and individual entrepreneurship. There are lots of nuanced findings, but it's also a tricky question because if you look at the individual policy entrepreneurship literature, most of them are case studies. And then all these heroic, charismatic leaders, policy entrepreneurs, they hardly work by themselves. Because many of them, one of their defining characteristics, the features, the attributes is that they're team players. They know how to build coalition. Of course, there are some variations, but overall, they always demonstrate the sort of spirit of team building, team players, and so on and so forth. Of course, when they act in individual, when they play the individual role and when they join the team, there might be some sort of nuanced differences in terms of their strategies and attributes. But overall, as I said, individual entrepreneurs are oftentimes team players, right? And then, of course, in the end, probably we'll figure out hopefully, myself is also looking into healthcare reform, public hospital reform in China and in Hong Kong, and we have already identified some collective entrepreneurs and individual entrepreneurs, and then we'll probably do some more case study and announce some sort of generalizable patterns. Thank you very much.
Okay, so
okay, I'll answer and then I have someone.
Okay. The multicollinearity was below 0.6, but there's still really good to look. And I didn't look at the combination of attributes and strategies, and I think that would be really interesting. I don't think that there's a self-reporting issue because it was municipal clerks who were completing the survey, not the policy entrepreneurs themselves. Unless I'm misunderstanding the question. And I think there was one instance where the clerk was like, I'm the policy entrepreneur. But besides that one, and this was following sort of a model of Schneider and Teskey. They did a bunch of studies in the US in local government trying to identify policy entrepreneurs, and they asked the municipal clerks because these individuals are not usually politically elected, but they take notes at all the public meetings and such so they know what's going on. And I try to avoid a single method bias by measuring success both on whether an individual is rated as successful by the clerk, but also whether a policy was adopted or not. So I realized I didn't, success definition. So so the success definition I use is whether or not a policy was adopted. So separate from the assessment of the clerk. And then I asked the clerk, how successful was this individual in getting the policies that they wanted adopted? So at least sticking with the same definition. And then to identify policy entrepreneurs, I asked the respondents to say, who was involved in your municipality in trying to get your decision makers to consider a policy, trying to get them to adopt a policy, trying to get them to change a policy. So trying to keep this focus on policy throughout all of this. The question about what distinguishes a social activist from a policy entrepreneur, I've wondered before. And I tell myself, okay, if you tell them that it's about policy, it can't be just, we set up a study group in our neighborhood to learn about fracking together. It has to be trying to learn about fracking with the goal of affecting policy. But I say that without knowing enough about the social activist literature to really say, right? And it's huge, right? Which is why I stay away from it. I'm like, I don't know what I do is different. But I know that there must be things there. And I think that's
So, Adar and then Edgar.
Yes.
Follow up now.
I love your paper. I think that is amazing. And I think actually it's not one paper. You write like 30 papers from the data that you have. But I have a few, well maybe 2 questions and one small comment that might help you. So the first thing is, do you know why some states don't follow their neighbors? Because you said that when some states, you found that most states follow their neighbors, but some states don't. So that might be an interesting thing to look at, why these states didn't follow the neighbor.
like anomalies, like who are the weird ones who don't?
What went wrong, there with the policy entrepreneurship? Second thing is, I don't know, did you read the protocols of the meetings of the city before? So you have the protocols?
Well,
the notes, like I guess that when they decide to adopt a policy, they have a meeting in the town. a hearing, and then there are protocols probably, so. Do you have that? Can we get that?
We can sometimes, yeah. We could do it for like a sample of them.
So that can really help prove your case, I think, because then you will understand better who the players are and understand, maybe they will tell you what their, goals or motivations are and stuff like that. And then this is not a question, this is just something. The literature on information flow from management studies talks about the fact that when there is opposition, that's when the information gets known to the public. And that's when policy changes. So you might want to look at that.
So I just want to ask Darren Edgar whether you have any comments on your own papers that you want to respond to, and if not, then we'll collect
If
more
anybody
questions.
has a question to our paper,
Edgar?
No,
Not yet. So shall we collect some more questions? Because we have a little bit more time.
So question, the first question is when, because maybe you said it, but maybe I just missed it. So if I understand it correctly, most of these clerks signal advocacy, other people, from civil society actors. So none of them signaled other clerks or themselves.
There was one that indicated that he was like, yes, and it was me, but
okay.
Yeah.
So then I'm then asking, what is the implication of these four theories on street level bureaucracy policy entrepreneurship? So how do you, how would you write a paper on, especially shown on that, and with your case? And then the second question would be to Alex, if you could, for example, imagine how, if you were to compare with the large and policy entrepreneurs, for example, in Western and Asian context, so how would, for example, the level of democratic development, so the quality of democracy, play out? I think that's one of the easy variables you can test in a large end setting. And then, for example, corruption, that's another easy variable that you can test. And then, of course, there are the complicated variables of, for example, the culture, more, and I think that's the interesting one, and where definitely one can learn from. But that's like the usual suspects when you do a large end.
Yeah.
Two quick questions. One for Edgar, and my question has to do with the fact that you said that the difference between those two cases was very much about who the people were advocating, and you gave an example of lawyers versus engineers. And I'm sort of thinking maybe it's just that they're better negotiators, politicians, and that's why they get further and not, I don't know how well. So that's just the engineers can, that's sort of that's what resonated with me when you did that. And my second question is to Gwen. If policy entrepreneurs' success is defined by whether the policy was adopted or not, then how can, if there was a policy entrepreneur, be a variable in that regression? Because if that's defining the policy entrepreneur's success, he can't be. But do you understand what I'm saying? I think the problem here has to do with, if we're talking about the policy entrepreneur's success as the ability to, I know they're two different regressions, but then when you're giving it as an example of what success was, and your research questions have to do with success of policy entrepreneurship, I think you're going in a circle with if there is or isn't a policy entrepreneur, and if the policy was actually adopted.
Sorry, Gwen, I've got a question for you too. It's not a critique, but no, I actually really like what you've done. And I know it's actually very difficult to do that, the kind of careful work that you've done in order to do that quantitative work. But I'm just curious about the New York case. Do you think that the groundswell of efforts that you observed at the local level had any influence on the governor's final decision to say, I know the governor got that report, but there was some discussion, I know I read about this at the time, people were saying, well, the price of natural gas was going down anyway, so you know, it was fine for him to pass. But I'm just curious about whether you think that some of this advocacy at the local level might have actually filtered back so that the people at the state level at Albany might have actually said, you know, like, this is really big, and we should go with what's happening on the ground.
So maybe quick responses from each one.
63% of the land that would have been frackable in the southern tier was put off limits, or development was restricted on it by these local measures. Well, or in combination with one state protection that would have been for the development. And so I think they had a huge effect. Like the local actions had a huge effect on being like, we don't want this, and maybe these local regulations aren't going to hold up. Well, they did get held up, but like basically saying we don't want this here, and putting them backing the state officials into a corner, basically. Like they could let it happen for like the rest of the other 40%, but yeah, the price of natural gas is coming down anyway, and yeah. So I think it made the choice far easier. I want to talk to you more afterwards because I got confused. But yeah, this could be a good question. And Rena, your question, it's a really good one, and I wanted to ask you here. So in the framework that you have with the SEAM, so it's I'm trying to think through why none of these clerks, or very few of them, were activated. The things that motivate activity, right? It's knowledge, or a perceived need for more knowledge, a perceived crisis, and what's the third one in your framework of why somebody becomes that?
So, no.
I'm trying to apply this framework to
What
it.
about motivations?
Motivations or
And motivations, like what causes somebody to try.
Well, it's very hard to exactly know what motivates actors. As I said yesterday, I personally believe that the main variable would be self-interest motivations.
In our cases, they both we interviewed the regulators, and they both said that they wanted to do the right thing.
Yeah. That was the formal.
So that's what their answer is.
It's not necessarily about getting more salaries, or there are altruistic elements in self-interest. But Adele knows one of them very well. She worked with him.
Both of them actually.
Both of them actually.
One of them was my professor in Tel Aviv University. I'm a law and economics scholar, so I'm also a lawyer, and I studied at Tel Aviv University Law School. So David Gilo, the competition, he was head of the competition authority. He passed this reform, so he was my professor, and I was his research assistant. So he was, and the other one, I worked with him because I was head of regulation section for one of the biggest banks in Israel. So the banking regulator was someone I worked in front of.
So what would be your guess? What are their main motivations?
I honestly believe them. I think actually no. I think David, the professor, I think that he wanted to do the right thing, but I think it was also interesting for him to test if his theories were right in real life. But he would never say that. That's like probably. And I think the bank regulator really did want to do the right thing. So he really did believe that putting fees under supervision is a bad idea, which I agree with as an economic scholar. And he thought that the competitive market will solve the problem better, and he had an idea of how to ignite competition in the market. So, both of them identified the window of opportunity. So there was already something going on, and the politicians already wanted to do something about the problem, but the politicians had their own ideas, and basically what the regulators did, they went and convinced them to change the direction. So, but this is a strategy. It's not a motivation.
In order to bypass throwing a lot of fire when you are saying when you are talking direct on motivations. So one way to bypass this minor is to talk about goals and leave the motivation to others.
I think you have a lot to speak over lunch.
Yes.
But maybe Agar, there was a question to you and then to Alex as well. And then you conclude.
Quick response. So it was. So why a coalition with lawyers and urbanists will be more effective than one with architects and engineers? Well, first is that the lawyers will know much better how to navigate the decision-making process, so that they will know the laws. For instance, in this case, in order to make the government to do this consultation, one of the things the lawyers did was to take that to the Mexican, to the ombudsman. So they knew how to do that. So that was one thing. They were good about navigating that. And also the urbanists are still very good at advocating for policies. They knew how to navigate the social media, and also they were very visible because they had this experience. They did that before in other places. So that was important. And the engineers and architects, they were very proficient in technical terms. They knew that they was going to be floating as it happened. They didn't know how to communicate outside their so that was, I think, one of the policies effective.
All right, it's my turn. So thank you, Elena, for the question. And actually, I truly agree with you that in order to construct an effective dialogue between East and West developing countries, then developed countries, you've got to have a sort of common basis of comparison, right? And then, so eventually you cannot compare apples with oranges. And so there's a whole bunch of exogenous and endogenous factors to consider. And we'll definitely think in that way, for example, as you suggested, and the maturity of democracy, the level of corruption, these are very, important factors that might, influence the outcomes. We'll definitely think in that way towards a more large and, analysis. Thank you very much. And before I finish, probably I want to throw out a very quick comments to Gwen's paper. And basically measured policy process, right? A policy success. And then probably there are two types of policy success. Procedural process and substantive process, right? This is something you might want to distinguish them. So the passage of a bill basically represents a procedural policy success, right? But whether the expected behavior changes on the part of the policy subject has truly happened, and how that, sort of changed the outcome, this is the sort of substantive policy success. Of course, that takes longer time to measure, and then probably, distinguishing these two aspects of policy success might be helpful in the conceptual individual.
I also want to use the last one, if it's okay, as a chair prerogative, to follow up on Shlomo's comment about, which relates, I think, to some of his, is there a difference, or, I'd say this is an outsider, right, to this, but is there really a difference between policy entrepreneurs versus social activists? And I think it might be one worth looking at the whole very useful literature, I think, about social movement outcomes. Right, and then, under what conditions do social movements lead to policy change? That's one thing. And then the other thing is also there's a very good literature on new institutionalism, which has been merged with the literature of social movements. And what they're trying to do and show is this idea of what they call institutional work, which they look at institutional entrepreneurs using the literature of social movements in order to show institutional change. So I think there's a bit maybe good merging to it. Thank you very much to the four presenters and for excellent discussion.
So what's
I just want to go to the hotel
where exactly is it? Like a buffet style?
אבל אני חושבת, לא, קודם כל זה בא באמת מאיזושהי הנחה של לצד העובדה שאני
I'm just wondering if you have
ואני זוכרת שזו הייתה אחת המדינות
I'm studying creation. Different aspects. And one of the things that I do is now studying what convinces and we're doing it from
זה היה תראה, זה קורס שזה קורס I think we have it for like a supplement for something. אז אני גם מנסה לעשות, ועוד דבר שעשיתי זה הבאתי זה אורח שבאמת את נועם, מכיר אותו, נכון? מכיר את נועם שהיה דוקטורט של אז בגלל שהוא דווקא יש לו איזשהו חיבור מאוד טוב של איזשהו בסיס תיאורטי ביחד עם הפרקטיקה, אז הבאתי אותו, אבל אני חושבת שאולי זה אולי מישהו נוסף שבאמת יעשו את החיבור הזה.
So we can, because what we have with the other author, we have that we run it on text. And there's a computer program that runs the underlying oral regulatory text. And we test it, for example, like our first project is now.
Yes.
We tested Buzz, which is like global dance data. Dance translation. And they have like 3 versions of that sort.
בינתיים מנחה יקר, מאוד רוצה להיות בפרזנטציה, אבל הוא מלמד, אז ביקש שלא תתחילי, אני שנייה, שלא תתחילי איתי לפני 12.
את לא תציגי?
לפני 11
אני רוצה שאני אכניס אותה ואני אציג? כאילו אני גם פעם צריכה להציג. אני בתור פאנר ונציגה של...
אני וניסים, מותק.
אמרתי לו. אני צריך להציג. יש לי קונספט. אמרתי לו, מה אתם מביאים אותי בתור איזה נפגונר?
הם מניחים לזוז.
אז את רוצה שמישהו אחר יהיה את שם?
את יושבת פה?
לא, אני יכולה בכיסא אחר.
אני אדבר איתו.
ואז לי יצא להציג, שאני אציג. למה אני יכולה?
כן, לגמרי. וואי, את יודעת לא, אני שומעת.
אני אציג. אז הוא מגיע בזמן. לא, הרי אי אפשר להתחיל.
לא, אני שנייה anyways, אז לא, פשוט ש... לא, הוא ביקש כאילו שהדיסקשן יהיה אחרי ההרצאה, זה לא לחכות לסוף. כמו שעשיתי כאילו יהיה הרצאה דיסקשן.
לא, או שמישהו, אני אציג נגיד שנייה, ועד שמישהו... I wanted the transcript. Yeah, I wanted to see how often one versus the other.
That was the one thing we ran into. Like sometimes they work actual and they don't have their transcripts. Like they just.
No, is this mine? I'm gonna take this. Yes. Thank you. You're welcome.
Right here.
Ja, vergaderen.
That's right. They have to.
How long have you been here?
Year and a half now.
So is it staggered?
It's
Jeremy has been there for a while.
Yeah, he and I have been doing it for a year and a half now. And then it's a 3-year term and then it's renewable. But
But as a team or?
Yeah, 2 of us, yeah, a team. 2 co-editors and team.
Yeah, but it's not just what you,
So we split
expect to cost.
a lot of the responsibility between the 2 of us. There's
We
just so
do,
much
but usually it's more
that one of us could do
meetings.
all around, subject submissions and a lot of other things too.
No, it's just a thing.
Well, there's some truth to that, yeah.
I was asked to do some of that.
Yeah, so we came like a bunch of us last time, it was small.
And everything depends.
I think there were 4 of us were abroad.
Two variables. One is what do you want to do with it? How does it further your
Yeah.
me basis?
Right.
The next one, I don't
Give
think,
your heart and soul.
usually at
That's
the
right.
end, there's like a
But
meeting
the other
and then
thing,
somebody
how
is
much
supposed to volunteer to take the next
school will
one.
help?
I think we knew very
I wanted to do this at a time when it would have been good for me.
No, I don't know, we've done it once.
Thank you very much, we'll give you a pat on the back, that sounds great.
Right.
No, I don't think so, guys, you don't
Right.
understand.
That's right. So far, my school's been very supportive.
Fantastic.
We'll see if that keeps up.
Been there for a long time.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm glad you